And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia's scary monsters and super creeps keep me running scared. And we know we're in Halloween season, and the synchronicities have been off the charts as I was going into the Gurdjieff material over the past couple of weeks, especially J.G. Bennett's material. A lot of weird synchronicities and things started to happen in relation to the study. And so I thought tonight we would take off the hat of current events and put on the full metal jacket of mysticism and the mystery schools through the figure of G.I. Gurdjieff and the fourth way teaching, and a really major revelation sitting in that work, not very often explored, and I don't think anyone really knows what to make of it, and that is the law of accident. And this law is a cosmos law, and it applies into our everyday lives. It applies into the lives of nations. And it's interestingly enough, there's something in the Cayce readings about there are accidents even in creation. Peculiar statement here, but true. We're going to get into what this law of accident is all about and how Gurdjieff's work of the fourth way is something, again, like Steiner's anthroposophical work, set for the 21st century. So much so that, even in Gurdjieff's lifetime, he didn't really release any of his books, oddly enough. He did have the books out for meetings, and they would read them aloud during the meetings. But in terms of the publication, at the end of Ouspensky's life in 1947, his chief student, he put out In Search of the Miraculous. That's really what put Gurdjieff on the map, largely. And then Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson and Meetings with Remarkable Men are the foundational books of Gurdjieff, and yet none of them were available. Isn't that extraordinary? So this work, they understood themselves, was something that was to grow. This was the seed they were planting in their lifetimes, and then it was to take root and take flight after the fact of them leaving this plane of existence. Very interesting indeed when we think about that. I stress that with the work of Edgar Cayce as well, which is during his lifetime, he was not very heralded. And in many ways, it was in the 1960s when they discovered so much of Cayce's work and his work around reincarnation, Atlantis, psychic experience, life after death. All of that became a foundation, along with a lot of theosophy and yoga. And that really took us into a whole mystic era. But it didn't happen until the 1960s, long after they had actually done the work. So that's something to think about as well in relation to the work that's happening, because it was very pertinent to the people doing it at the time, but it spread a seed that would give root later. And we are the later, apparently. We're also going to be taking your questions tonight. This is a special report. We'll try to go about 90 minutes. Of course, we always go over, but in the second half, we'll take your questions. And Miss Olivia, you can ask those questions now, and Miss Olivia will be taking them. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Really enthusiastic. Nena says, just love the worldwide reach of DJ. And Jessica Rodriguez says, I love Friday nights. Favorite day of the week when I get to watch this show. Seriously, the best podcast on YouTube. My favorite show to watch right here. So much information, and I learned so much.
Isn't that nice? Wow, incredible. Well, it's great to have so many of you out there in the Ideas Room, and your contributions really make the show for me. I want to mention, I went on Sam Tripoli's Tinfoil Hat podcast, and that's just coming out. It was actually just being put out as I was going live tonight, and I'll put that up on our Twitter account for everyone. It's a very fun interview, and Sam's a funny guy, but he's also a deep thinker, and he asked all the right questions, so we had a great time. And someone told me that we got some kind of a shout out on the Joe Rogan show from that interview, because Sam went on the Rogan show right after that.
Very exciting.
That's all very nice, and I will put out the Tinfoil Hat podcast as soon as we're done with the show. We didn't get around to it because that just came out today, but what a blast with those guys. And I do want to say that there's something happening where, sometimes you can reach people. And I think comedy in this era is a particularly good way to reach them, with deep ideas. So whether it's from the political spectrum or the esoteric spectrum, whatever it happens to be, it's always good to get people in that mood of talking about it and making it kind of into a common parlance for everyone, and really to get it in there, because it is, the whole thing about the cosmos and everything else. We see so much doom scrolling for everything. The laughter and the openness of that kind of, comedy that is in the heart of everything reminds me of the things that Cayce had to say about Jesus during the whole crucifixion ordeal, that he had this kind of merry attitude and they couldn't understand what was going on. We have to sort of adopt that, going through crises, and that's really what's going to get you through. And I think the comedy is important for spreading the messages. So I was happy to do that one. We'll see how it came out. I had a good time with it. And I do also want to mention that, when it comes to an election season like the one that we're in, reflecting on the work of somebody like Gurdjieff, who was all about staying away from suggestibility, one of the key tenets of the fourth way teaching that he brought forward was about non-identification. So you don't want to overly identify. You have preferences one way or the other, of course, but the kind of over-identification that you see so prevalent in the society makes people into maniacs. I remember Gurdjieff got some questions from students, and they said, well, how can I be, a good Christian and this and that? And he said, well, it depends on what you mean by Christian, because, there are some people who act like they're Christians, but if somebody disagrees with them, they're ready to roast them on hot coals. So we have to understand there's a complexity and there's kind of an aspirational thing that's going on when it comes to Christian faith, that we need to aspire to these things. And so it's a very incomplete, we're malleable, so we're moving toward it. And it's very interesting because very often you hear mystery school work defined as esoteric Christianity. That's what Steiner said it was. That's what Gurdjieff said it was. And if you think about Cayce's work with all of the kind of Christian background that he had, Sunday school teacher and all the rest of it, but he talked about reincarnation and Atlantis and all these other things. And, the churches that he was a Sunday school, as soon as they found out he was doing all these incredible psychic readings, would try to get him out. Because that's, Virginia in the 1920s, they were pretty conservative. And to have this guy, contacting the other plane and talking to entities and things, it was a big no-no. So I like this idea that we're mature enough now to adopt an esoteric Christianity. That's the kind of piece that we need going forward, because it's a much fuller picture than a strict dogmatic church approach. And there's value in all of it. It's one of the very reasons why you see so many efforts in society to stamp out religion and stamp out Christianity in America. It's because it's such a powerful central force. But when you get into the hardcore depth of what's going on, then it's different, because you see that, you start to consider things from the point of view of the mystery schools, and they've got, for example, Jesus living many lifetimes to develop into the ability to be Christ. And so this is a kind of a pattern thing. And then you have other major figures, like John the Baptist reincarnating as Raphael. The mystery schools, if you look at them all, they all agree on this fact. This is an interesting point of view, because not all of these mystery schools agree with each other on dates, on certain characteristics. But there are some key things that they do. And you can take reincarnation or leave it. It's not required, but it forms a central understanding for all this. And it's a big part of the thing that they try to bring forward. What's interesting is one of the key players in the fourth way, P.D. Ouspensky, who was right side by side with Gurdjieff in this and really brought his work out before he had a split from him and a kind of Freud-Jung separation. He is somebody who's very fascinating, because he brought forward the idea of eternal recurrence. And he wasn't thinking, you reincarnate into another lifetime in the future and things of that nature. But recurrence is a very unusual theory, and it has Eastern roots as well. In the law of Manu, you come back over and over to the same lifetime in order to get it right. And so he was obsessed his whole life with eternal recurrence, because everywhere he went in his own lifetime, he was constantly having a feeling of deja vu. And one of the things that he suggested about recurrence is when you start hearing about it, it means, you become aware of that. And so recurrence, a different approach, a totally different spin on reincarnation. So, I think it opens up, the fourth way does this, is it comes out of the theosophical, anthroposophical viewpoint and does these sort of other things along with it, and then what you find at the end of the day is they all go into the ancient Atlantis part. They all understand that there's another level of life to contact. And so there are just different aspects of how these mystery schools work, and the timing, I think, also is important. So we're going to get into the time tonight. Tonight, this is a Special X series special report, Gurdjieff, Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed. And I'm going to go into how that law of accident is seen from the mystery school vantage point of the fourth way. And as I mentioned, we'll take your questions. Before we go any further, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch, and you'll find out about the incredible X-Series episodes, mind-blowing, that we have coming up for you. Interviews like you wouldn't believe coming up for November and December. Of course, we have a very exciting documentary to debut for you on November 22nd. I'll give you more details on that. We have part one of our docuseries, Hacking Atlantis, the CRAZE and the HOTZONE. That's already out there, and I have it up on our channel for free for everyone. And that docuseries is going to be something that's explosive, and we're putting a lot of information and a lot of production into that as well. There's some fascinating things. If you want to learn about the Hot Zone shows we do there, that is the key. So we've got it up there for you. It's gotten a great response. And all that is available to you at your fingertips when you're on that newsletter list, and it's all free. So that's a big plus. Make sure you're on that Stand Up and Be Counted. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you got the floor.
David Donaway says, I have to keep coming back until my jokes are funny. Sigh.
David Donaway is kind of one of those stars of the Ideas Room. He tends to...
He's the superstar.
He really has a wealth of information, and we're happy that to mix it up with him on that level, because he's always coming up with very interesting facts indeed. A few things I want to say about Gurdjieff's work, and I've experienced it. It's very interesting. I was involved with 3 different Gurdjieff schools. One was based on the Gurdjieff Foundation, one was based on Bennett's work, and the other one was based on Ouspensky's version of it. And they were all 3 very interesting. Some things were more interesting than others. And I do have a feeling that nothing that I ever experienced with those groups felt like it had, what it had was that ability to gather information and work with the ideas, which I appreciated. But I've always felt that there's something fascinating about the Gurdjieff work, which, as much as people have gone forward and try to understand what was being put out there, it's difficult. And it's difficult because it's coming from a very hidden mystical tradition, 1. 2, Gurdjieff is Greek Armenian, and he was bringing this to a Western audience. And then he was operating in Russia, and Ouspensky was his chief student. So you have a lot of international sort of translating of ideas, moods, context, and all this kind of thing. And it's very fascinating, though, because so much of the mystery school activity has come out of Russia and Ukraine. Let's not forget Helena Blavatsky and her sister, born there. And very interestingly, one of the things I found out when investigating the early life of Blavatsky, is she grew up very close to what would be a central UFO location where a major sighting and landing would take place like a century after, I think that was 1989. So it's just interesting to me how some of these things come about. And I think Blavatsky does play into this episode, even though it's a Gurdjieff episode, because Gurdjieff, is kind of part of the Blavatsky template because so many of her experiences become his experiences. She goes off to this Himalayan quest. She meets the masters. She studies in the mystery schools. She brings the teachings to America. She struggles. She's persecuted. She brings the thing back to the France and the UK. So there's an awful lot of overlap with what the schools were up to. And although Gurdjieff would, be going after at times the naivete that was going on at this stage in theosophy, Ouspensky, who was the Russian philosopher and esotericist who was his chief pupil and really brought his work out, because Gurdjieff didn't have any of the literary gravitas of someone like Ouspensky. Ouspensky already had a best-selling book out. And he had written Tertium Organum, I think it's 1908. So he was already on the map, and it's a major piece of work. But if you look at Tertium Organum, which I think is a very important book, it's got all these quotes from Blavatsky. Every time you open a chapter, there's a big Blavatsky quote sitting on it. So the influence of theosophy just hanging right over Ouspensky. And so when you get that into the Gurdjieff work, there's something that happens where it seems like theosophy starts to divert, and then Steiner picks up the Christian mysticism banner, and then the Gurdjieff work comes in and shakes everything up and just says, we don't need any theosophy. It's all about work. You're all going to work on yourselves, and you're not going to worry about ascended masters. You're not going to worry about your cosmic reincarnation cycle. You're going to get a handle on your physical self, your will, and your moving center, your emotional center, and your intellectual center. It was a different wave of how to do this. And so I think it was an experiment, and a very, very deep experiment, as you'll see. Before I go any further, what do you got there?
Jonquil Dory wants to know, are we going to cover the Kunda buffer tonight?
I always include the Kunda buffer in there, and it is quite fascinating. So I would say that there's a few things in the Gurdjieff work. Another one is about accumulators, which I'm going to read a quote about tonight. And supposedly in your physical body, one of the things that you have are these two major energy accumulators, and then a third one. So the third one is your actual life force, and the other two are what happens in the course of a day, the regular energy that you get going on. And when they switch over, you can feel it. Somebody has a lull, they feel the need for something to pick them up, coffee or cigarette or something, and they need a break, and then they're back. They feel great. This is the accumulators switching over. But that main accumulator, which is driving both, is something that, yogis and those who practice mind over matter and extraordinary things, like walking on coals or lying on a bed of nails, they use this very special energy. And the only problem is you need to know how to use it on a kind of expert level, because although the other accumulators can go down to zero and then refill and all the rest, the main one cannot be allowed to go down to zero because it is your life force. But this is how some of that deep information that Gurdjieff brought out of the mysteries is kind of unlike anybody else, just like him bringing forward the Enneagram. There's a couple of interesting biographical hints about Gurdjieff, whose life is, again, very, very mysterious. Now, I've pointed this out before, that a number of these characters who are the deep mystery school teachers intentionally obfuscate their childhoods and their dates of birth. And there's a reason for that. It's so the other groups can't get a handle on who they are too early and thwart them before they, are able to rise in the work that they're doing. You will find that, for example, Rudolf Steiner has two dates of birth, February 25th and February 27th. Nobody knows which one it actually is. you're going to find that Gurdjieff has 3 different dates of birth, one from 1864, one from 1872, and one from 1863. So his birth date was obscured, and if the more and more you go into this, Blavatsky's birth date got obscured. So then I've always wondered about why the dates were so, panicky around these people, and why it was an erratic pattern that you never exactly knew where they were born. And sometimes their childhoods, it would seem like they were 2 different people growing up. And this became unusual as well. The more I got into it, if you look into how Steiner, for example, describes how the mystery schools on the left side, which are kind of the darker secret society types, they are very obsessed with somebody coming in and how they can use them, or, somebody coming in that they can derail before they get up to their full mystical potential. And so these people need intentionally to obscure, for an astrological purpose, the ability for somebody to be able to scan their birth date. This becomes important, and I will say the early life of Gurdjieff, what we do know is that he was incredibly influenced by this small group of people known as the Yazidis, and their mystical traditions, and the fact, they have a very mystical, deep psychic tradition, which is quite unusual. They have a peacock as this kind of incredible demigod that is part of their worship system. And, remote viewing, what we would call remote viewing in the government, over psychic distances and things, is something that they train into their children. So the Yazidis are very interesting because Gurdjieff became fascinated by them as a child. And one of the incredible accounts that he gives is, when he was 8 years old, he was seeing these other kids draw a circle around one of the Yazidi children, and the Yazidi child couldn't leave the circle. And they knew, they thought, okay, we have him trapped. And they put him in this circle, and Gurdjieff was very confused by this as a young child. And he went to great lengths to erase the circle. And when he did, the Yazidi kid felt like he could run out of this circle. But this is so deeply ingrained in them, and it's such a secret tradition. What's interesting is if you look in the 20s and 30s, there's a character who hangs out on the fringes of the Gurdjieff movement, and Gurdjieff takes great pains to spend time with him, and because he went and lived among the Yazidis for 3 years. And the Yazidis generally, their home base is in Iraq and in other parts of the Middle East. But it's quite fascinating because they came up recently with all the things that were going on and this incredible, crazy ISIS group and all this stuff. And they were kidnapping all these Yazidis. And it was always my belief when that was happening, it was under the Trump administration, when he was really getting rid of this whole ISIS group, that when they were going in there and grabbing these Yazidis, it was one of these unusual things to get to the bottom of it. This is part of the archaeological wars that were going on, but also this mystery school faction just getting rid of competition, as it were. And so they made a great impression on Gurdjieff when he was growing up. And there's a few lost chapters as to him growing up. But one of the things that we know for sure that Ouspensky had discovered when he was spending time with him is that Gurdjieff was actually a stage hypnotist at a young age, in his 20s. And he developed an incredible ability to heal people of ailments. And at the time, opium addiction was just incredibly widespread throughout Asia and Central Asia and the Middle East. So he became a man in demand for doing this. And as a matter of fact, later, even into the 1920s and 30s, we have stories of people who are working with him in different ways. And he still, this is a major part of his practice, which is people, sometimes very high profile people, are still coming to him to cure addiction. And so one of the things he discovered during his hypnosis investigations was the incredible suggestibility of people on a deep level. And this is very interesting because he realized it was the root of this kind of brainwashing and propaganda that was growing up around this World War I atmosphere. And at the time, there were other wars that were happening just before that. And he was seeing this kind of, you could see it rising in the population, very much as people would a generation later see it rising. Jung would see it rising in Nazi Germany. But he wanted to get to the root of it. And there's some very interesting comments that his student, J.G. Bennett, made about it, which I'm going to quote here in a moment. And before I go any further, though, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Harvardian says, DJ, the Yazidis have blue eyes, Atlantis link, and wasn't ISIS trying to eradicate them? Archaeological warfare.
Yes. Well, they were stealing them, too. They were kidnapping them. And there's no question that they wanted the source and the methods. And, here's a whole generation, thousands of years. Supposedly, the Yazidis had memorized the entire epic of Gilgamesh so that when it was discovered, it was like the early version of Noah's Ark, basically. It's the Sumerian version of all that. When it was discovered, they knew it as an oral tradition. So they had it down pat. And when it was discovered, it was such a match that Gurdjieff himself said, this is quite extraordinary because they must have kept it word for word. They didn't need the books because passing that whole story and the whole tale down was something that they did. And what he found out eventually was that the stories would be maintained and beyond the reach of book burnings and things like that because of a series of movements. And these became the Gurdjieff movements later. And what he learned when he went to the mystery schools was that 50 books could be contained inside of one dance ritual. So if they wanted to talk about astronomy, they'd have a dance group come out and describe what astronomy was. And if you knew how to read the alphabet of the symbols, then you were all set. So things like whirling dervishes and this kind of, deep Middle Eastern dance traditions come directly out of holding a tradition in a place that is not anywhere where it can be eradicated. Because remember, there's a central tenet in the Gurdjieff work that there's two sides to the mystical revelations. One is the what to do, and the other is how to do it. And the religions give you what to do, be kind to your neighbor and all of these different principles. But then it's very hard. And so you figure out, what is it? How do you do it? Where do you get the method to turn the other cheek and things like that? Well, the method, the how to do it stays underground because when that's above board, that gets persecuted and those people are run out. So we always find this crisscross in history of this knowledge seeming to come out of nowhere. And when it's referred to, like the Rosicrucians and things like this will come up seemingly out of nowhere, but they've maintained a tradition in the background. And the mystery schools have been like that apparently since the days of Atlantis. And it makes a great deal of difference when you look at it over the course of time. You can see the Akhenaten mystery schools. You can see Pythagoras as a branch of this, the Greeks, and all the rest of it. By the time you get to Theosophy and Anthroposophy and all the rest, that is the reemergence of this tradition. And it's signaled very early on by Francis Bacon and people of that nature that we're going into an era where we can wake up to this again. So, you're not going to be burnt at the stake for studying reincarnation or something. That's a very important place for humanity to reemerge. And it had to, because those schools realized with the incredible scientific materialism that was sweeping in, that humanity was going to be cut off incredibly directly from its core spirituality. And what was it going to be left with? Pure materialism, pure scientific solutions for everything. As a matter of fact, even traditional religion with its problems was going to be eradicated in the face of this. And supposedly even elements inside of traditional religion worked with the mystery schools hand in glove to make sure that a lot of this information came out as a a kind of a wall, a pushback against the incredible waves of scientific materialism, which we can still see taking us over with the pharmaceuticals and with the cybernetics and the transhumanism and all the rest of it. The 21st century is the perfect example of this. How does the Gurdjieff work fit into this great awakening? That's what we're going to get into next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the Gurdjieff Law of Accident Secret Mystery Revealed. I'm going to read some very interesting quotes about that law of accident and how important it is to understand. It's a little obscure thing. It's one of those gems sitting in the middle of the mystery school knowledge. And like the eighth sphere information from anthroposophy, it gives us a heads up about the environment that we're in. And it's not an often magnified, it's not stressed very often by people who research into these things. But I've always felt the way that it's discussed, if you really listen to how Gurdjieff and Ouspensky talk about it, it is absolutely crucial to an era like the one that we're in. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. We, as I said, we did put down the hat of current events for this show, but we all know that next week is going to be gearing up for that election. It's going to be a week then from next Tuesday, so we'll be doing a lot around the election coming up as well. And what do you got?
Cameron, Steiner to God, says the Bible works on many levels. It is both literal and allegorical, but it is literal in a spiritual sense, quote, written by spiritual people for spiritual people, unquote. Thomas Ball says, I would call it a myth, properly understood. A myth is not a falsehood. A myth contains a deep truth, a psychological truth. What is the deep truth of Christianity? Human beings can be transformed, born again. Jesus tells Nicodemus, you must be born again.
Yeah, we got so many interpretations around this. Wow. And the idea that you can be in your regular everyday life and then become something else means that you carry within you the seeds of something super normal. And I find that very interesting because when you awaken that, you are literally a different person. So that is being born again. And because there is a kind of a traditional life that you can use and that nature will use you for, to have your family and to, kind of go through life. But there's a deeper life that can be experienced along with all that. And this is what I think it is. And you can awaken inside of all these different circumstances. Very often, I think especially in the era around the early 20th century, the idea was, you'd have to, go off to a monastery or something of that nature in order to achieve any kind of spiritual anything. And what the Gurdjieff work in particular with the Fourth Way, and I should describe what the Fourth Way is, but what they were basically saying was that the people who are experts in the Fourth Way, the people who had used it as a system to achieve a kind of spiritual evolution on Earth, did it in the normal everyday conditions of life. So they weren't off in a cave. They weren't off at the top of a mountaintop. They weren't in a monastery. They were right in their regular everyday life. As a matter of fact, the Fourth Way only operates in everyday life. So, if you work at a bank and you study things at night, that's where the Fourth Way takes place. You don't go anywhere to go do it. If you are an inventor, it's all everyday thing. If you're a policeman, it all operates right where you are at any particular moment. That's the role that you're fulfilling. So in the Fourth Way, the first three ways are ways of spiritual evolution. And one of the ways is the ways of the fakir. And this is something that's kind of an aloof concept for us. I keep trying to come up with a good example, but basically the fakirs in India and in the East generally, they can overcome any kind of body challenge. So, the lying on the bed of nails, walking on hot coals. The fakir idea was very popular in that era. When you say fakir now, people don't necessarily know what you mean. But the way of the fakir was total, they'd spend their entire lives overcoming the body. And there was a tradition that got handed down. Here's how you overcome the physical center so you don't experience pain. You can do all these different types of things. This comes up a lot when you talk about endurance with athletics, people who climb mountains and things of this nature. There's a fakir quality to all that. It's the overcoming of the physical. And that is actually a path of evolution. The second way, so that's the first way. The second way is the way of the monk, the way of the priest. And this is emotional. You're working on the emotional body here. And the emotional body, it is devotional. And so the priest, the adept, feels so much devotion to his spiritual life. He creates a spiritual path through the way of devotion. So the way of the monk, the way of the priest, is this incredible outpouring of devotion. And then the third way, the way of the yogi, is mind over matter. And the mind over matter works on the intellectual center to bring the mind directly in line with the will, so that anything that the will desires, the mind can accomplish. It's a study. It goes, they can go into any realm. They can command their mind to go wherever they need it to be, as any great yogi can do. What's interesting, when Gurdjieff says we're putting this system out, this is the fourth way, and it works on all three of the centers at once. So if fakir works in the physical center, and he's working on the moving center, the priest is working on the emotional center, the yogi's working on the intellectual center, bringing the spirit into those three. But the fourth way works on the body, the mind, and the emotional center all at once. This is the remarkable thing about it. This is the breakthrough, as it were. So there's no question that Gurdjieff's mystery work is a kind of experiment. I think that's a way you can think about it. I think that they saw him, the schools looked at him and said he's a very unusual person. He has a mixed quality to him, but he had such a deep will, strong will, that he's kind of like a maverick in this sense. So they sent him out to do this. And over again, he would encounter difficulties when he was dealing with things himself. But when he had an intermediary, like an Ouspensky or a Bennett, he could open himself up to all these other contacts and have much more success. When he was operating himself, his own personality got in the way, his own stubborn qualities, his own, you might say, very difficult teacher type of qualities. One of the things that he did was he brought over to America the system of the Enneagram. And on some level, when I look back at him, because in 1915, he's there with the Russian students teaching them things. When he comes to America in 1920, it's almost like a Martian has landed, because Gurdjieff is so far out from what's happening in America in the 1920s. And he is here presenting a system and trying to teach that deep mystery school system to, a public that just is getting through with World War I. And he does all these demonstrations of moving exercises and something called the stop exercise, and really elaborate movement dances and things with his group that he's instructed on how to do this, because Gurdjieff had great knowledge on how to do those Gurdjieff movements with having the students adopt them, and then they could put on a performance. And somehow when the audience left, they were transformed. They weren't sure quite what was going on. But the demonstration of the Enneagram and the stop exercises were things that only happened, this was the first person to bring any of that over to the West. And so there's a whole kind of crisscross that's going on there. And it's fascinating because I believe, when Gurdjieff's in St. Petersburg and he is developing this contact with Ouspensky, and Ouspensky is bringing him out to literary circles, I think what's happening is very interesting because Gurdjieff's very open. He's bringing his system out, and he's talking about, humanity is a machine. Humanity is in sleep. They need to wake up. They need the self-remembering tool, run a wheel of different eyes. And, he's giving a number of different tools that are instantly a system of evolution and spiritual teaching. And they have very practical values as well. So there's a kind of a meditation in there that is not so much of a cosmic meditation, but it is an awareness fixation. And that's the self-remembering. One time, Ouspensky had remembered that Gurdjieff drew it as an arrow pointing outside at the world and back at yourself. So you're constantly aware of yourself while interacting with the world. And you can see in this era, with the advent of the technology and people on their phone, all of that is gone. So the awareness level is even lower. More tools and more information, but the awareness level has actually gone down, interestingly enough. One of the things that Gurdjieff was trying to do was awaken the public. He was bringing these tools to say, you have to stay awake, you have to work to stay awake, and there's a certain kind of track that the world will put you on, but that is just anybody's guess of where that's going to lead. Your own will needs to direct your life, and you need to put these tools into place to do it. So his background as a hypnotist was quite fascinating. When he discovers Ouspensky, it's interesting because he does things to off-put Ouspensky immediately. And one of the things he has him do is meet him in these crowded places that are like crowded bars or cafes where he can barely hear anything. And it's hardly what Ouspensky is expecting when he goes to meet him is, this incredible master is going to give me this philosophy or whatever. And what he notices immediately is that Gurdjieff, he said, speaks Russian badly and with the wrong accent. And he said the kind of accent he's using is basically like, almost like a Bronx, New York accent. And he said it was as far away from what you would expect for a philosophical, spiritual teacher as you can imagine. So Gurdjieff's putting on an antic here. He's acting to try to flesh this guy out. Is this guy just going to run away because he's like, well, these are difficult conditions to meet under? He's making it difficult. So that first gateway that they get through, has to be because Ouspensky really wants to be there. But he also makes himself kind of, into a joke in a way by, we can just imagine that whole thing with the accent. And you have this very, kind of educated Ouspensky meeting him and meeting this guy who's putting on a Bronx accent. This is all part of the luring in, I think, of Ouspensky. And what happens is Gurdjieff says to him, your book, Tertium Organum, is so excellent. And he said, I would bow down to you right now and make you my master because of what you wrote in there. He said, that's if you understood what you wrote, but you don't even understand what you wrote in there. And this gets Ouspensky into a really interesting headspace because Ouspensky had very psychic experiences even as a youth. Once he encounters Gurdjieff, though, it's interesting because that's the only picture of them together. And I have to say the dynamics there are clear. And Ouspensky's the one in the cap in the back, and Gurdjieff sitting there with the pipe, of course. But that dynamic, I think, is very clear there of the dominant Gurdjieff and Ouspensky kind of learning from this teacher. But we have to remember that Ouspensky, again, was really necessary for Gurdjieff. He was already a best-selling author and stuff. And yes, Gurdjieff had already learned these things that Ouspensky was after. But the dynamic eventually, in a way, after a while, shuts Ouspensky down from his own great work. And he just becomes a very, he's the ultimate proponent of the Gurdjieff work. But at a certain point, he separates the ideas of the Gurdjieff system from Gurdjieff himself. And that's part of a process which is very reminiscent of what happens with Freud and Jung, where at a certain point, Freud realizes, even though he's learned, he's Freud has been his mentor, Jung really takes a look at him and says, he intentionally is leaving things out, and I need to go further than this guy. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, in this case. I've seen this pattern over and over again. I've even experienced a little bit of this myself. And it's not easy because what will happen is you have to make a very serious move. And at the same time, you realize you're going to sacrifice learning a number of things because you need to kind of go your own direction. And by the time you get to 1921, that has happened in the case. So he encounters Gurdjieff in 1914. They have about 7 years, and it is in that 7 years that Ouspensky puts together all the notes that will become the foundation of In Search of the Miraculous, which is the book that in 1947, after Ouspensky dies, will come out because Ouspensky says, I'm not putting this book out while I'm alive, but upon my death, here's instructions on here, publish it. And it's interesting because as the story goes, when that book comes out, this is the book, In Search of the Miraculous. When this book comes out, Gurdjieff, who's incredibly critical of everything, especially, any kind of journalism of any kind, he says, I cannot believe what an incredibly accurate account of everything that we did that this is. This is a feat of memory. He's really blown away. So both Ouspensky and Gurdjieff agree that this is the foundational thing that happened. And I also think we're going to see it as the most fruitful period in Gurdjieff's life. He's just come out of the mystery schools. He's coming forward with the teaching, and he's very laser focused. Later on, it's going to be up and down. It's going to be a roller coaster ride with Gurdjieff along the way. But in this period, there's kind of a glory thing of Ouspensky fulfilling this role that is stated in the mystery schools, that the only way to advance yourself is to put someone else on the level that you are in, and then you advance. That's how the teacher-student work goes in mystery schools. And Gurdjieff was never able to do that, but he came the closest, it seems, with Ouspensky, and they had the incredible simpatico. There's a lot of strange things I want to mention about Ouspensky as well. And one of them is that Cayce, in his readings, goes to Ouspensky a lot. So he's recognizing on a psychic level the deep work that Ouspensky is doing. Something in the work of Ouspensky is a crucial element of bringing the mysteries public. And there's a certain point when I've pointed this out that if you read there's a couple of Cayce readings, but one in particular where he's giving this incredible overview on the fourth dimension, and he stops in the middle of it and he says, this is Ouspensky giving this here. Now, the reading is being channeled through Cayce, and we would figure, well, it's some character from beyond that's doing it, but Ouspensky is still alive. So there's Ouspensky living in the UK, and he's channeling through Cayce, who's in Virginia. So there's some, once you start to tap in the radios on the mystery channels, you start to see, oh, these people are tapping into each other quite a bit. But I think that the work, when we get around the work of Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, we see that something remarkable is taking place. The other thing that Cayce had to say about Ouspensky came up when they said, what do you think of his Tertium Organum? And Gurdjieff said, and Cayce said about Ouspensky's work, he said Tertium Organum should be foundational, for anyone who wants to learn about spiritual matters. And then he starts to kind of muse about who Ouspensky is, and he says, oh yeah, we see that he was in the temple. He was the keeper of the records for the Mahabas. And then he starts going back through the years, and he says, oh, he's 7, born in the 7th year, the 7th day, the 7th hour, the 7th moment, 777. And he goes into this mystical trip. Whatever it was that is Ouspensky, when he comes in, he realizes, aha, the version of life that we've been sold is totally different from what is actually happening. And he's going to spend his life in search of the miraculous, as it were. Strangely enough, he finds it, but it's not as easy as he thought when he started. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a special X-Series presentation, Gurdjieff, Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed. The Law of Accident, we're going to get into that. I think we've got enough foundation here. We're going to take your questions in a part 2. I'll go for about another 20 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Song of Power says, the man-machine with whom everything depends upon external influences, with whom everything happens, who is now one, the next moment another, and the next moment a third, has no future of any kind, and only very few men acquire an astral body. If it is formed, it may continue to live after the death of the physical body, and it may be born again in another physical body. This is reincarnation. If it is not reborn, then in the course of time, it also dies. It's not immortal, but it can live long after the death of the physical body. Fusion, inner unity, is obtained by the means of friction, by the struggle between yes and no in man.
Oh, wow. Well, a lot of that is a quote from Gurdjieff directly. I think the reincarnation part is something that's a good summary. You know, I want to tell you an interesting thing about this. Gurdjieff had this concept that you need to earn your soul, you know, and you need to earn your astral body and things like that. And I think I understood where he's coming from. It's very interesting. If you go into the work of Cagliostro, you're going to find there's all these illusions, and the Masonic orders get a tremendous amount of knowledge from Cagliostro. Cagliostro, when doing his Philosopher's Stone information, the whole idea is that you can live outside of your body, outside of your physical body, and extend your life in your physical body to 5,527 years. I kid you not. Cagliostro is no slouch. Very, very deep on the mystical track. What was he alluding to? Well, once you get into these schools and once you get into this whole type of teaching, you realize that you can develop your astral body to be in different places at once, you know. And we know in the case of remote viewing and things like that, they would send them with coordinates on certain missions and certain errands. But some psychic people have that ability just through suggestion. And the coordinates, as it were, are just the address of where they need to go. So we developed this name for it later. I do think that there's something very powerful to this idea that those groups understand that you have different abilities that in the regular everyday run of life we don't often use. Although you will see extraordinary stories of, you know, in the case of a missing child or something like that, someone will have a dream. I was reading a case about this a little while ago. This woman had a dream, and this is on the West Coast. There was a case of a missing child. And she had a dream of where the child was, and she submitted it to the police, and they went and looked for it, and they found her. I mean, this is how that interconnectedness works. There's no scientific explanation that would work. You know, the kind of ridiculous, disconnected scientific explanations for things like that won't fly. There's an entirely different system operating than the scientific materialism that we've been kind of born and bred to. At the same time, it's good to be aware of both this to keep a balance, right? That's where spiritual science comes from. But when you think about Cagliostro and what he was saying, that you have this ability and what he was teaching his students to live much longer, I believe, based on the mystery school work, that you can actually live as long as you want to live if you are, if you do the work inside of those mystery traditions. Now, for most people, for the average public, none of that is going to make any difference or any sense, and you just live a long, good life anyway. But there is a quality inside of that work, which is same when we get to stories of Saint Germain. Look, Madame Blavatsky pointed out over and over again that Saint Germain was around in the period when they were building Theosophy. And he was a person, he wasn't a ghost. Now, he supposedly died in 1784. And at the time, he will say, oh, I'm going away, but I'm going to come back. It might have been 1789, actually. But he says, I'll come back, in 75 years or something. And then it turned out that when he was talking about the years from when he would come back was exactly the date that the Theosophical Society was formed again. So there are some characters, some players in all this whose lifetimes evolve beyond any kind of ordinary lifespan that we would imagine. To us, there's almost a science fiction to it. And yet when we start to talk about things from a mystery level, we can imagine there are actual people who've developed the ability to live as long as they want, literally. So, in a sense, that whole idea of a mystery tradition where you're interacting with beings that are here just to help, I think part of the idea is that they've overcome things physically, and so they have the ability to kind of pop in and pop out at will. So when Gurdjieff is talking about building an astral body and building a soul and things, I think he's getting at that. And, for us, it seems like a question that's up here somewhere. But let's just think about it in terms of developing a thought form and then the thought form becoming real. So, we hear all the time about these people. I read a story about Jackie Gleason, and I know there's so many good alien stories about Jackie Gleason and the flying saucer house and everything. But one of the things I read about him was that he grew up very poor. And so he had a weird transformational thing happen when he would look at something, he would want it, but he couldn't have it. But he had such a will inside that he was creating a manifestation, magnetic attraction to the thing. And so when he went and did, some of his theatrical comedy and all the rest of it, he became very successful very quickly. And he had all the things that he was looking at and obsessing about. So he had kind of actualized the whole thing. So we understand that kind of actualization. When we talk on mystery terms, we need to say, well, what were the goals? At a certain point in lifetimes, if people get very advanced through various lifetimes, what become the goals then? Well, you've transcended the earth plane, and now your whole goal is just to be of service. So therefore, the sky's the limit in terms of what you can project and what you can get. At least we can start to understand that there's something else operational here. And it's interesting because what we hear about very often are elites who want to, have this age extension technology and live to 150 years old. And some of them are going to get there, scientifically. But it's problematic because if you are just living longer, but, you're in this position where you're not working on your spiritual life, then you literally are actually downgrading on a spiritual level. So, the point is, why would humanity want to live an extra 100 years? What would you do with it? And then that, I think, becomes a very dynamic question. And I have no doubt that humanity, if you look back, you can see stories going way back in that Atlantean period. Humanity lived on a much, much longer basis. I think they lived to about 800 years old. Yes.
Did Gurdjieff talk about entropy, the nature of the airplane? That everything sort of is in, naturally is in decay, and that we have to fight it?
I think the way he described it is that there's a kind of sleep to the regular way of life, and that in nature, you become food for the moon. So that there's a kind of an animal life that takes place, but humanity has such the ability to be something totally different. And so the potential lies within. And I think we've seen it over and over again with people that we've known in our lives. Their potential is great, but do they actually live up to that potential? Do they get the breaks? Do they have the willpower? So there's a number of factors, I think, that are involved. I'm going to read a few quotes about the law of accident because it comes in here so important, and it's a big revelation sitting in this fourth way teaching. Before I go any further, I want to mention that you want to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps you posted on all the incredible shows that we have coming up for you. Live documentary presentation coming up in November, mind blower. Incredible interviews coming up for November and December, including Gigi Young and Dr. Farrell. We have some remarkable X-Series episodes for you as well, and live events in the making. All of that is there in that newsletter at darkjournalist.com. Stand up and be counted, and make sure you're on there. I started off the show by saying that I just had done the Sam Tripoli podcast, and I see some people in the Ideas Room who said, "Hey, I came over here after watching the Sam Tripoli thing. It was a blast to be on there." And I was saying to Olivia, I rarely do interviews, but let me tell you, that was fun. And those guys, Sam himself is a smart guy. He's a funny guy, but he knows a lot of the right questions to ask. So we had a blast with that. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Roger Wilco says Gurdjieff regarded electricity as an impediment to conscious development.
Oh, that's good.
CB says, I started noticing the awareness level going down literally when the flat screen and smartphones came out about 2008. And
Yes.
Wesley Sullivan says, divided attention. Great point. I often wonder how shocked Gurdjieff would be to see the zombies in the streets today.
No, it is a problem. And it's funny because I think you can operate with the technology and be, more efficient and more aware, but it's not lending itself to that. And when I see people having full conversations walking down the street and even making wild, because when some people talk, they get very animated, but it's so out of place, and when you're walking, and sometimes, you have to take a call or do whatever it happens to be. But I think what's happening here is there's less and less integration of people, ideas, thoughts, energies. And you are connecting through technology to things that are not in your physical space. So it's an incredible attribute to be able to do that. And I love being able to communicate right here on this technology with you right now. But I think what happens is there's a very special something that happens when people exchange ideas, exchange even simple thoughts and niceties and things to each other in person. So when you're walking around just in technology, it can be just, you're lowering your sense of awareness, situational awareness. And I know that there are those days, and the technology doesn't even have to be a factor. Some days you can just be in a daydream or something and your awareness is low. But the technology seems to be pulling people into this sphere of unconsciousness. And I think that some people can handle, kind of doing both. But the sense of attention, the quality of attention is so important. When you get around mystery school work, attention is everything. And you'll find in regular everyday life, it is the ability to focus that becomes so important. And even when you are going into a kind of a dream state, on a creative level, that's still a kind of focus that's going on. So I think that there is something to that, which is with the advent of the technology, we've seen it go down. We've seen people's driving go down. That is for sure. Absolutely. Okay.
On that, this is a side note.
Yeah, I was going to say driving into accident is a good parlay.
That is good.
What do you got?
Well, I just wanted to ask you about what I've been noticing lately is everyone's poor impulse control. And, that, people can't allow others to complete a thought without having to interject their opinion. They get triggered.
Yes.
But even more than that, the if somebody is out there in public filming, just, people are out of control. They're unhinged. That's the term everybody uses. And I think a lot of it is coming from a performative nature of they have TikToks or whatever it is. And
interesting.
So I'm wondering what Gurdjieff would have to say about that aspect of technology, is that people are no longer living their real lives separate from technology.
You, that's true. There's a line in the Gurdjieff work about becoming a non-entity. This is important because the eighth sphere aspect is waiting for non-entities. So if you empty out your consciousness, through a process like that, where you're just lost in what's going on, you become a non-entity. And that is interesting because in the Gurdjieff work, you become suggestible and when you're asleep. So the whole point is to do all these things to stay awake. And so you have all these concepts in the Gurdjieff work, like super efforts, for example. so that, sometimes instead of driving to the store, you walk there. It's just something that changes the dynamic of what you do and who you are. And they're done on purpose over and over again. And, there's a lot of interesting examples of people who traveled and spent time with Gurdjieff where, when they had to do things for events. There's one musical couple that is with him, and they have to get a cake for this event. And it's very easy for them to go to this wonderful, bakery where everyone goes. And he insists that they go to the other side of town. It's very difficult. There's a lot of time problems. And they get in the car with him, and he drives like a maniac, And so there's all this stuff that takes place. But the end of the story is, by the time they get it and they get back and all the rest of it, they feel a little bit different. So they were going in this kind of unconscious fashion. And he, through his what seemed like erratic behavior, was throwing a little monkey wrench into this perfect event. And they didn't feel like they were in a daydream anymore. So there was a quality that they were working with now that wasn't there previously. And, not that people should drive erratically or anything like that, but there's a lot of examples along that line, which seem very simple on the surface. And you're like, I wonder what that's about. Let's get a little bit from the horse's mouth here on the law of accident. This is Gurdjieff talking to his students, and Ouspensky recollecting it perfectly, as Ouspensky, Gurdjieff would say upon seeing its publication. All right, so they are talking midway here, so you're going to hear a few things like sea influence and things like that. And I won't get into what they all mean, but I'll try to explain some of them as we go along. The results of influences whose source lie outside of life collect together within a person. He remembers them together, feels them together. They begin to flow within him a certain whole. He does not give a clear account to himself as to what, how, or why, or if he does give an account to himself, he explains it wrongly. But the point is not in this, but in the fact that the results of these influences collect together within him, and after a certain time they form within him a kind of magnetic center. Now, we've talked about a magnetic center before, which is, it's a core evolutionary piece that takes place within a person when they are working, say, with esoteric ideas. For example, so we understand that books only take you so far, and you need to have some actual practical experience or working with a group or meditation, whatever it would happen to be. But the books can form within you a magnetic center, a documentary around these things, a book, and you start to create a magnetic center which starts to draw in things to you. It creates a core and a basis. It's not the full, you can't learn the full spiritual track through a book, but it can open up a center within you. That's the start. Interestingly enough, that's related to the law of accident. And we'll see how here. Now, the influence of the man who knows the way upon a man who's seeking the way, the first man, is a special kind of influence, differing from others. First of all, in being a direct influence, and secondly, in being a conscious influence. Influences of the second kind which create magnetic center are conscious in their origin, but afterwards they are thrown into the general vortex of life and are intertwined with influences created in life itself. And they are equally subject to the law of accident. Now here's where he brings it in. This is one of the first times he mentions it. The law of accident. Influences of the third kind can never be subject to the law of accident. They are themselves outside of the law of accident, and their action also is outside the law of accident. Influences of the second kind can proceed through books, through philosophical systems, through rituals. Influences of the third kind can proceed only from one person to another directly by means of oral transmission. The moment when the man who is looking for the way meets a man who knows the way is called the first threshold or the first step from this threshold, the stairway begins between life and the way. And there lies the stairway. Only by passing along the stairway can a man enter in a way. And in addition, the man ascends the stairway with the help of the man who is his guide. He cannot go up the stairway himself. The way begins only where the stairway ends. That is, after the last threshold to the stairway on a much higher level than the ordinary level of life. This is a very important piece that's being drawn out there. So what he's saying is there are different influences. For example, you get certain types of information, and after a while, it just gets mixed up out there. So we had this huge injection of Eastern meditation stuff in the 60s, and then, yoga and all these other things came out of it. But after a while, those are very deep esoteric traditions. They get thrown in a mishmash, and, it becomes, in a marketing campaign, they'll throw in things like, and some people might like it, but I'll say like hot yoga or something like that, right? Which is a totally different thing. So you're mixing influences and coming up with this thing, which is totally different to the character of the original thing. And just like when there was a huge new wave thing, say around the year 2000, and there came a whole new age movement out of it, the whole Crystal 2012 thing, and it was over the top marketing for new age this and new age that. The core ideas around the new age thing and, thought manifestation, spiritual evolution, there were all these characteristics, but also what came out through that were things like The Secret and Sting, which were really heavily marketed affairs. So what you see is you'll have a core idea which comes from an esoteric center. It gets poured out into the public in an exoteric fashion and acts just like all the rest of the mechanical stuff. So it still has the name, it still has the general appearance, but it's lost all of the potency of the core aspect it had. You can still form some of your magnetic center identity out of it, but even with the fourth way, you can see that the Enneagram became part of this too, because here you have a very deep esoteric thing that Gurdjieff brought out, and then by the end it became a parlor game because other groups had gotten their hands on it and just turned it into this guess your type thing. And it's true that it is helpful for guessing types, but it's a much, much deeper thing. So you had kind of superficial applications of these things. What Gurdjieff is saying is there's a quality of information which is not subject to the law of accident. Now, the law of accident we can understand just on a basic sense. There are always accidents that take place all over the world involving different things. But also the law of accident in the Gurdjieff system is living under a different evolutionary track, which means you could be subject to all sorts of influences that you wouldn't be subject to when you were conscious. So if you have developed a certain level of consciousness, then you're not subject to the law of accident like that. Now, it's very famous because, Gurdjieff was in 2 famous car wrecks. And so a lot of people taking it literally were like, you have this very evolved guy who talks about the law of accident. He's in these huge accidents. And, so again, it's conceptual. When you're in the midst of the thing, it doesn't mean, you're not going to have a physical accident, but it's bringing the idea of this law of accident as something that holds back humanity, that when we're subject to these shifts and these sudden changes from the outside, all of the development that we've had can be unwound if we are subject to that law of accident. Now, if you go into the core of the Gurdjieff work, there's a thing called the Wheel of Eyes, and there's a series of shocks that come from the outside world that move that eye. So someone makes you upset over something and a different part of your personality comes out. And he actually gives them different names. You might have Steve, Peter, and Paul, and each one of them, one of them is a little bit more understanding. The other one is very angry, whatever it would happen to be. But as long as you were living in that shifting wheel of eyes, you would never get the ability to be one true individual. So these are the types of things that the Gurdjieff work, when it goes very deeply into that personality structure, tries to get one to take a look at. And the fact that there are almost psychological elements in here attracted some people, like Maurice Nicole, who'd become a great student of Gurdjieff's, but he was also a student of Jung. And he brought the two systems kind of in, just working on a psychological level. What's interesting is when you get around the Gurdjieff work, you realize it doesn't just work psychologically. You're going to have a total mystical factor with it. And the law of accident is an overlooked piece in the work. I'm going to read more about it as we get back into it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the next series special report, Gurdjieff's Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed. We're taking your questions here shortly. And we decided to put down the world events for today and just go straight into the mystery details. We will be, of course, back next week with an election report and all the wonderful things that are going on there. Election day, of course, being a week from Tuesday. What a momentous time period to be in here. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
David Donaway says, didn't Steiner talk about a man that gets hit on the head by a pot falling off a balcony needs to understand at a certain point his oversoul allowed this to happen for a purpose? And also, for the enlightened one, there are no accidents?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Steiner did say that when you're an adept, you allow things to happen to you, and that you know, you can prevent things that kind of a nature. I don't think that he explained the law of accident so well, and it's very interesting because Steiner explains Ahriman, he explains Atlantis, he explains the eighth sphere. He gives such a deep overview. You can learn so much from his work. And then if you move to Cayce's work, he explains, the deeper things around Atlantis. He explains psychic experience and all the rest. So each one of these groups have their expertise, and they do overlap, as I mentioned, but there's a kind of expertise driving each line, each thread. And it's interesting because the original mystery schools were under such siege at a certain point. They realized that this work will not survive. So what we need to do is split it off in 3 different places and 3 different practices. And so one line of the schools became all about the philosophy of the thing. The other became about the theory of the thing. And then the other one was the practical application of it, the actual methods. And they would move those, India, Egypt, and Persia. So the different expertise pieces and then bringing it all back together into one central system becomes, I think, maybe the task of the 21st century that we're in now. But it's a good question, actually.
How is the law of accident different from like a law of chaos, which is just sort of a pattern in the matrix?
Yeah, it's very interesting because the law of accident, when you're unconscious, you're subject to more laws. And this is one of the things that Gurdjieff said, that you're subject to a certain set of laws when you're just kind of going through your regular everyday life. The more you raise that consciousness, the more your awareness is raised about you, your will, and your aim, and the things you want to do. A lot of things fall away. And it's funny because there's a work called The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution by Ouspensky, where, the question gets asked of Ouspensky, can I, with all the things that are going on in the world, and there were world wars, these guys were in the middle of the Great Depression. I mean, they saw the real hardcore stuff. You think this is a bad period? They were in a majorly challenging period. But, some of those questions that would come to Ouspensky were, how am I going to do anything in this environment, such a disaster facing the world? How am I supposed to work on myself and my own development? And Ouspensky said, well, you'll find that the conditions around you, basically the world that you live in, changes as you work on yourself. Now, I think there's a lot of implications in that, literally meaning if you are a different person, that the reality that you're in is different also. And that goes to a very deep level. Are we all experiencing the same Earth?
They say no.
Well, it's interesting. It doesn't seem like Ouspensky is saying it's all the same for everyone. It's not. When you raise your consciousness, the world that you're living in is different. The conditions themselves change. Well, that's pretty major. And I remember a few years ago, a lot of people were really hyped on Dolores Cannon. Do you remember this?
Of course.
Dolores Cannon, she had a hypnosis technique, and she would hypnotize these different people, and they would give her insights on different things. And I met Dolores Cannon. She's a pleasant woman. And but one of the things that was in there that she would bring up, and it never went very, very deep, but it was just a superficial idea, that there were going to be two Earths, the two totally different parallel futures. And, the world that you chose, if it wasn't going into a world of fear and all that other stuff, you'd be in this other world. And if people were locked down on a thought level into this other one, they'd go into this world. And the whole point was to choose the right world. The whole dimensional shift was in there. Whatever someone might think of that, I think there are roots in what Ouspensky said about the conditions changing based on the fact of who you are and based on the fact of what you do. So yes, there is a shared reality on one level, but there's another level on which that reality is not shared. You kind of create your own tone, as it were. I think that's an important concept to keep in mind as we look at some of this. I'm going to read a thing about suggestibility and then go back to the law of accident, and then we'll take your questions. Mm-hmm. Sound good?
Sounds good.
How's the temperature out there?
We got some scholars in the ideas room tonight.
Yeah, that's great. I always get, the people who study Gurdjieff work or Steiner's work are some of the smartest people and who ask some of the best questions, interestingly enough. This is interesting. Gurdjieff, when he is searching out the schools, the school that he finds is the Sarmoung Brotherhood, and that's their symbol, which, when a triangle is placed in the middle of it, becomes the Enneagram. This school, going all the way back to Egypt, is something that maintained the tradition. And it's very interesting because Gurdjieff spoke a lot in code to hide the sources of where he went and what he found. One of the things that Bennett did in his discoveries of what Gurdjieff had been up to before he'd been out there teaching the Fourth Way was to find out that he'd spent a lot of time with a group called the Naqshbandi Sufis. And that it was through his interaction with the Naqshbandi that he learned all about the Enneagram. So one of those mystery traditions that he opened up to was Sufi mysticism. And I think there are elements of that Sufi system right at the forefront of Gurdjieff's work. And that was a very hidden system from our Western traditions. And but it's very interesting because Sarmoung, according to Gurdjieff, meant keepers. And at first, it was interpreted, people thought he meant beekeepers, but it was bees who keep honey, became the literal translation of the name. And you can imagine symbolically the idea of bees, making and storing honey. That is the sweet kind of residue of the mystery knowledge, and the maintaining of the tradition was translated through bees. And we all know that bees occupy a very large place in the symbology in ancient Egypt, for example. But it is interesting that fundamentally the Sarmoung Brotherhood is the bees, A couple of things here on Ouspensky's experiences, because we have to understand that Gurdjieff has a track record of these supernormal events. So in order to really take his work seriously, it's important. These testimonials, I think, are crucial, especially with somebody like Ouspensky, who was absolutely hell-bent on the truth. So in the whole account is In Search of the Miraculous. Colin Wilson wrote a little small book trying to figure out Ouspensky, but he includes that incident that I find so fascinating that took place in Finland. And here's the account here, a little bit of Colin Wilson and a little bit of Ouspensky. Here we go. So this is Ouspensky speaking. So what happens is he goes and he's doing these really intense exercises in Finland with the group. But he wants to achieve this really kind of incredible level and the In Search of the Miraculous. And what happens is while he's working and he's in this intense kind of elevated state, Gurdjieff reveals kind of a rumor that Ouspensky had fed to him about one of the people who are there. So, let's imagine it's something damaging personally to the guy. Whatever it was incredibly embarrassing for Ouspensky. So he couldn't believe that Gurdjieff had betrayed him in this situation where they were doing this. And then he told him this thing in confidence about one of the students, and that Gurdjieff is blurting it out here and saying, Ouspensky told me. So he's going right to the core of, Ouspensky's trust, basically. And so Gurdjieff, Ouspensky says, I'm leaving, I'm getting out of here, even though he's in the middle of this kind of intense opening his Kundalini, because he's sort of upset and he thinks, oh, Gurdjieff is playing around here. And so he continues his account here. And with this, the miraculous began. I can say with complete assurance that Gurdjieff did not use any kind of external methods. That is, he gave me no narcotics, nor did he hypnotize me by any of the known methods. It all started with my beginning to hear his thoughts. Suddenly I noticed among the words which he was saying with us all were thoughts which were intended for me, and I caught one of the thoughts and replied to it by speaking aloud in an ordinary way. Gurdjieff nodded at me and stopped speaking. There was a fairly long pause. He sat still, saying nothing. After a while, I heard his voice inside me as if it were in my chest. Think about this in terms of technique. Near the heart, he put a definite question to me. I answered him in the affirmative. He at once put another, still more definite question to me in the same way. And again, I answered the same way. The two students who were with us were obviously astonished at what was taking place. This conversation proceeded in this fashion for not less than a half hour. So Gurdjieff, whatever techniques he had learned, he knows how to speak directly in somebody's body. Now, Gurdjieff didn't do a lot of kind of parlor tricks for people. And when he met Ouspensky, he referred to things being miraculous, but he didn't do anything, he wasn't reading his mind and all that stuff. Here he is demonstrating kind of a complete psychokinetic ability. Okay. And then he's still thinking of leaving and all the rest. And he's thinking to Gurdjieff, kind of sending him this message that, like, I have found something in doing this work. And Gurdjieff is blowing him off and saying, no, you only think that you found it. You haven't even gone to do it. But Ouspensky is absolutely convinced that he's on the right track. So back in his own room, Gurdjieff again began to speak inside Ouspensky's chest. They held a conversation while Gurdjieff was out on the veranda with others. Ouspensky is again reticent, but it's clear that Gurdjieff was trying to force him out to make some kind of a promise, probably to stay with the work, even if things got difficult, and to leave, not to leave the work. He gave Ouspensky a month to make up his mind. The next morning at breakfast, Gurdjieff again read Ouspensky's mind and advised him to stop thinking about a certain question. During the next few days, Ouspensky found himself in a strange emotional state, so that he remarked to Gurdjieff, how can this be gotten rid of? I cannot bear it anymore. Gurdjieff's reply was, this was what Ouspensky had been asking for. He was now awake. Ouspensky comments that he is not certain that this was entirely true. Back in Petrograd, Ouspensky not only continued to converse with Gurdjieff, who was on the train going to Moscow, but to actually see him. So, Ouspensky, actually, they have this reverse. Ouspensky is going in a train from Finland back to Russia. And Gurdjieff, he's hearing Gurdjieff for a while, but then at a certain point, Gurdjieff just shows up in his compartment, and he's sitting there conversing with the projection of Gurdjieff. So these are truly extraordinary accounts by, after all, a journalist, which Ouspensky was, as much as he was an esoteric teacher. And he has that whole conversation with this projected version of Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff pops out, and then when he shows up back in Moscow, Ouspensky walks around for a couple of days, and what he sees are people walking around in dreams. So he can actually see the content of the dreams that are over their faces if he looks hard enough. So he's in a very strange state, and this is the nature of when you start to trip into these abilities, it can be very disorienting. But what we get from that story is that the techniques that Gurdjieff had learned, like the classic story with Bennett saying, I want to be taught astral projection, and Gurdjieff giving him a method and just saying, well, you can sit down and do this and you'll astrally project. And Bennett sits down and he does the method and nothing happens. It's a half hour later, and Gurdjieff pops in and says, what's the problem? He says, nothing's happening. This didn't work. And he said, just keep doing it. You know, you'll get it. And so he comes back a little later, and it's worked. Bennett is now above his own body. He can see his own body. He can look down, and he sees Gurdjieff open the door, look at the body of Bennett sitting in the chair, and then look up and see the astral body of Bennett. And he makes this kind of smirk, like, oh, I guess you got it. And he closes the door and takes off. So these techniques that he's learned in the mystery schools, just we can start to see right off the bat that there's something going far beyond normal. It's a super normal experience. So we need that foundation when we start to look at some of the things with Gurdjieff. Ouspensky had some interesting things to say about the law of accident. Then I'll do the follow-up law of accident quote from Gurdjieff, and then we'll go to your questions. Mm-hmm. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Gurdjieff, Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed. And we, as I said, we've checked out of the world, as it were, and current events thing, which are driving so much of the news cycle right now. And
bringing our vibe down.
Exactly. And now here we are putting on the full metal jacket of the mystery train, the mystery schools, and we're going to a different place. Although I hear that Joe Rogan is interviewing Trump. Isn't that fascinating? Mm-hmm. That is quite an event to be taking place as we're doing our show live. Okay. Here's Ouspensky. Things happen in human life according to these laws. The law of accident, when an event happens without any connection with the line of events we observe. The law of fate. Fate only refers to things to which man is born, parents, brothers, sisters, physical capacities, health, and things like that. It also refers birth to death. Sometimes things can happen in our life under the law of fate, and at times we see very important things, but this is very rare. The law of will. Will has two meanings: our own will or somebody else's will. We cannot speak of our own will, since as we are, we don't have one. As regards another person's will, for the purpose of classification, every intentional action of another person may be called the result of the person's will. Over and over again, to build in this idea that in developing your will, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky reinforce that what you think of as will now is so infinitesimal compared to what it could be, that they basically like, you can't even speak of what real will is. I mean, you have an understanding of what will is. But I think it is important for us to remember that whenever they speak about these things, they're telling you have much greater capacity underneath. Okay, he gets a question here, and it says, you said that man is a machine and moved by external influences. Where does this control come from? And Ouspensky says, there's no control. We must change to have control. Things happen all around us and we are affected by them. At every moment, our life is intersected by other lines, so that another accident controls most events. Accidents control most events. The section and the action of one machine affects another machine. We are surrounded by possibilities of accident. If one does not happen, another does. When do we cease to be under the law of accident? When we develop will, to be completely free from the law of accident is very far. But there are different stages between complete freedom and our present position. In ordinary conditions, accident is opposed to plans. A man who, in one or another case, acts according to plans escapes in these actions from the law of accident. But actions conforming to plan are impossible in ordinary life, except in conditions where the combination of accidental happening chances to coincide with the plan. I'm going to explain this a little bit. So what he's saying is, and we're not talking about accidents just in terms of like a house falling in or something, but accidents to every line of things. And I also want to bring this in as an idea that we may be living in 2024 under the law of accident as a culture dramatically, and that the shifting of the culture, you know, everything down to the COVID op, to the scenario for World War III and these things, we're becoming more and more through somebody's control under the law of accident. And so a number of things now can take place. And the more awareness that we bring in, I think the gift left behind from the fourth way work is this idea of coming outside of the control of the law of accident and into a more conscious reality. Now, it's interesting to point out that when asked about the origins of the law of accident, they point to the cosmos. They literally say it could be the action of some planet. So you're subject to a number of influences that, in terms of your actual track of spiritual evolution, will throw you off. So therefore, in the Gurdjieff work, what you're trying to do is develop this other thing, this other quality, which is going to make you less subject to those influences. And, you know, the root of them could be the cosmos. It could be someone, you know, it could be a literal person. It could be somebody with a bad temper on the road. Whatever it would happen to be, it would cause a level of upset or change or accident in the situation that you're in. That becomes an entire evolutionary change of changing environment, changing circumstances, and changing events. So we need to become very acquainted with the law of accident. And through this work, again, it's just sitting there. It's this little gem in the middle of it. Yes, what do you got?
I always forget the name of this thing. What is the time thing where you put it upside down and you...
Hourglass?
An hourglass.
Yes.
I was listening to you and thinking, okay, so what this is, to me, obviously there are practices where you align with your higher self. And so more of your actual true essence comes into your body. And I was thinking that the hourglass is a perfect example of this.
Oh, yeah.
And that is the whole key. Otherwise, you flip it and it's all ego, right?
Yes.
So the more ego-driven you are, the less conscious you are, the more prone you are to the law of accident. And it would make sense that the opposite is true. So being like an avatar,
yeah,
you know, ascended master, you would not be.
Yeah, it's true. And what's interesting is this is awareness. So it is a quality of attention that you're getting at when you're talking about that. It's really true. And that is the core of the entire thing. There's an interesting technique that comes up in, it's a book by Fritz Peters, who spent all this time with Gurdjieff, and he was at the Priory in France, and he kind of grew up with Gurdjieff because his mother was an actress and she spent time there, and then she left him there. And Gurdjieff was kind of a surrogate dad for him. But what happens is he spends all this time there, and then he goes off, he has his own life, and then he goes to war. And he comes back a kind of PTSD person, and he finds Gurdjieff in France. And remember, he grew up from the age of like 6 years old, surrounded by Gurdjieff and growing up in that environment. And so when he comes back to Gurdjieff, he really is kind of a wreck. This is very interesting what Gurdjieff does with him, and I think it gets again to some of those mystery abilities. We'll read that. We'll take one more quote, and then we'll jump to the questions. All right. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I ran over. Okay. So he's waiting, and he said he's waiting for Gurdjieff to come back. He's gone to this place that he thinks Gurdjieff is at, and he's asked the secretary, and she says, oh, yeah, he's off for a walk. He'll be back. And he says, it was probably not more than an hour later when I heard the sound of a cane tapping up the sidewalk. I stood up rigid, and Gurdjieff, I had known it must be him, although I had never known him to use a cane, appeared in the doorway. He walked up to me without the faintest sign of recognition, and I simply stated my name. He stared at me again for a second, dropped his cane, and cried out in a loud voice, my son, like that. The impact of our meeting was such that we threw our arms around each other. His hat fell from his head, and the concierge, who had been watching this, screamed. I helped him retrieve his hat and cane, and he put one arm around my shoulders and started to lead me up the stairs, saying, don't talk, you're sick. When we reached his apartment, he led me down a long hall of a dark bedroom, indicated the bed, told me to lie down, and said, this is your room for as long as you need it. I lay down in the bed, and he left the room, but did not close the door. I felt such enormous relief and such excitement at seeing him that I began to cry uncontrollably, and then my head began to pound. I could not rest and got up and walked to the kitchen, where I found him sitting at the table. He looked alarmed when he saw me and asked me, what's wrong? I said I needed some aspirin or something for my headache, but he shook his head, stood up, and pointed to the other chair by the kitchen table. No medicine, he said firmly. I'll give you coffee. Drink as hot as you can. I sat at the table while he heated the coffee, then served it to me. He then walked across the small room to stand in front of the refrigerator and watch me. I could not take my eyes off him and realized that he looked incredibly weary. I have never seen anyone look so tired. I remember being slumped over the table, sipping at my coffee, when I began to feel a strange uprising of energy within myself. I stared at him, automatically straightened up, and it was as if a violent electric blue light emanated from him and entered into me. As this happened, I could feel the tiredness drain out of me, but at the same time, his body slumped and his face turned gray, as if it was being drained of all life. I looked at him amazed, and when he saw me sitting erect, smiling and full of energy, he said quickly, you all right now? Watch the food on the stove. I must go. There was something very urgent to his voice. I leapt to my feet to help him, but he waved me away and limped slowly out of the room. He was gone for perhaps 15 minutes. While I watched the food, feeling blank and amazed because I'd never felt better in my entire life. I was convinced then and am now that he knew how to transmit energy from himself to others. I was also convinced that it could only be done at a great cost to himself. Gurdjieff was in his 70s at this point. It also became obvious within the next few minutes that he knew how to renew his own energy quickly, for I was equally amazed when he returned to the kitchen to see the change in him. He looked like a young man again, alert, smiling, sly. He looked very much like he was in good spirits. He said this was a very fortunate meeting, and that while I had forced him to make an almost impossible effort, it had been, as I witnessed, a very good thing for both of us. He then announced that we would have lunch together alone, and that I would have to drink a real man's share of fine old wine. So Gurdjieff bringing him back out of this PTSD state using this strange blue light energy healing technique as an older person and slumping down and then getting the energy back. Again, the deeper knowledge of how energy works. And it's a remarkable story sitting out there in the Gurdjieff experiences. And I'm going to actually integrate the law of accident quote into the final section of the video here But I'm going to, at this point, turn it all over to you, Miss Olivia, and your questions.
Okay, the ship's cat says, this has been fascinatingly enlightening to listen to. It has shaken a bit of the rust off my brain. A lot of people are expressing that. They're glad to have a break from the politics.
Wow.
David Donaway says, if enough people change their thinking, the universe and probability adjusts. Prayer works, and positive thinking in a cosmic mode few of us understand.
Well, Cayce said thoughts are things. And when they asked him, how literal, do you mean this? Like, what would you say about it? How real are thoughts? And Cayce said, they're as real as sticking a pin in your hand. That's pretty real. So the control of thought becomes vitally important. What's interesting, and I've read this in literature from several sources, so I wonder about this, and I believe it's true, which is that the period that we're in has speeded up so that what somebody thinks becomes reality much quicker. So therefore, the ability to control thoughts and the ability to discipline your mind to think, on some kind of a positive basis and not project negativity is vital, is a crucial factor. And also, if you think of yourself as the projector of your life, then you are constantly invited to put out the best possible version of the outcomes in your life. So that's a spiritual principle. How it operates is very interesting. But we see that when we get to the Cayce work, mind is the builder. And there's so much emphasis on the hijacking of our intellectual faculties in the Gurdjieff work, and that different centers sometimes hijack the intellectual center. But he also talks about the higher emotional and the higher intellectual centers, and that the ultimate center in the human body is the higher emotional center, and its language is pure symbol. It only communicates in symbol. I think that kind of gives us some impression that there's locked inside of us, there are higher abilities. And it's very interesting because Gurdjieff would often use this analogy that what's going on is humanity is in a state where they're driving along, and just picture a horse and buggy with the driver who's blindfolded, with the horse who has blinders on, and then the master in the back seat not paying attention. So that's the state of humanity. And in some of those analogies, the rider is bound and gagged. So the master in the back is bound and gagged. That's how bad the nature of the situation is. And what needs to happen is the master needs to wake up, and he needs to take the blinders off of the driver, and the driver needs to take the blinders off of the horse. I think those analogies are very interesting and give us some indication of just how unaware the whole industrialization in Gurdjieff's view had made us. Had Gurdjieff come into the 21st century, I think he would be very alarmed indeed. Yes, what do you
Al
got?
Kaider says, the hourglass is a good analogy for transmutation, the two energies spinning in opposite directions that transmute in the middle.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the quality of energy is very interesting. I have a quote on energies from Bennett, and it's very interesting because Bennett over and over again boiled down to the Gurdjieff work to access to different energies within yourself and connecting those energies that are in the world. And that often we don't use what we have. It's like, having $1 million and never spending it, because no one's told us how to use those faculties. Well, when he's talking about states of consciousness and psychic impulses, let's see if I have the quote here. Oh, yeah. If we wish to understand something of the true potentialities of our psychic functions, we must realize that there is no way of obtaining from our centers their full possible work unless there is a supply of the two highest kinds of energy. Everyone with even a little experience in self-observation and in the study of centers knows how very little it is possible in the sensitive state, the state in which we notice what's happening. This can be called the half-waking state. It is quite impossible, though people do not realize it, to be in the full waking state without the conscious energy. It can be said in the ordinary conditions of life, of humanity, a person lives nearly the whole of his life with his psychic functions working only with automatic energy. Very occasionally, as a result of involuntary shocks from the outside, a certain amount of energy enters, and then one or another of the centers wakes up. It is extremely rare. It may happen 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. Then there is a sufficient supply of the energy released to give him the experience of conscious working on his centers. So basically, you have all these latent qualities. They're not manifested, but they're in there to be awakened. And so when you get around Kundalini and all of that in meditation, and it raises Kundalini to your third eye and all the rest, that is getting us, that's people starting to awaken to more qualities than just what you learned in school and what society demands of you. There's a whole different order, a whole different class of energy and psychic faculties that are available to us. And the question then becomes, how do you go about awakening those? And in some people, they awaken quite naturally. And in others, they really need a method. I think that's true for most of us. Yes.
Nanette Christ, DJ. My mom died of heart failure. I called in Archangel Michael. He shocked her 3 times and everything in the room glowed blue. She lived for 20 more years.
Incredible.
After, I was asked to train a security leader on how to contact Archangel Michael. He did. 1 million people outdoors in D.C. and not one police incident in 20 hours for the Bicentennial Festival.
Wow. That is absolutely remarkable. The influence of Michael in the mystery school literature is so deep on humanity. And I recall there are specific dates that show up over and over again. One of those dates is 1879, where, on the spiritual plane, Michael is victorious, and many of those forces come down to Earth to do battle and to kind of conquer humanity. They're thrown out of heaven. Now, this is a cosmology, and a vision with Steiner, but he points out the year 1879, which I think is fascinating. And then there's another occasion where Michael comes through the Cayce readings, and all the people who were there witnessing it said the whole room shook, and it felt like the windows were going to blow out. So, that Michael influence is a very deep piece, and the whole Michaelmas imagery that is deep in anthroposophy, you can start to peer into that effect that Michael has from the spiritual level. And it's funny because there's very little good information about Michael, except if you go to true mystery school literature. And the Steiner work, I think, has some of the best. Yes.
Timothy Guessing, is the astral body connected by a silver cord?
Yes. This is interesting. You can literally, the whole process of reading the Akashic record takes place in what is called the silver cord, and that is the structure that connects the pituitary, the pineal, and the Leydig glands in a human being. That is sometimes referred to as the Appian Way, and it's funny because right outside the studio, if you walk along Harvard a little bit, you're going to find Appian Way. And it's very interesting. This whole concept is that there are those glands that are set there. They're kind of like the crown jewels of your psychic awareness. And forces in everyday life do not kind of bring them to bear very often. And it requires a certain type of attention and energy for an average person to reawaken this quality. And it's not something that, as a society that's been passed down. And there are cultures where, like the Yazidis, for example, where they understand this very well and the whole culture is psychic and they're tuned in. I do happen to think in the East, they live more with spiritual concepts also. It's been a very materialistic trip in the West, although it's been valuable. There's been a lot of progress that's been made, but I think the reintegration of that psychic awareness would be crucial. And I think the taking on of, the torch has been passed from the mystery school explosion of the 19th and 20th century to us. What have we really taken from it? On a one-to-one experience, so many different people have been helped, and there's a ripple effect that's taken place. But I would also say that I think, in a sense, that there needs to be, if I were the mystery schools looking out at what humanity did with what they doled out through the public mystery schools like Theosophy and Steiner and Gurdjieff, I would say I would probably expect a little more from humanity because the rewards are great for engaging the work. So I see a new wave of this mystery information coming forward. And I think the X-steganography piece is related to it, which is why you see a competitor X-technology hyper materialism thing running right alongside it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a special presentation, Gurdjieff Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed. And we're taking your questions now. I'm going to read a quote about the law of accident from Gurdjieff, and then but first we're going to take a couple more of your questions, and then we'll wrap up our presentation for the evening. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I don't think Gurdjieff believes in humanity awakening. He mentions only a small branch can go down that stream, something about nature becoming aware if too many do it at the same time. What struck me from Gurdjieff is when there is a revolution or uprising, it's the sane, knowledgeable people who died and with them wisdom. So how do we move forward then as this is cyclical?
Well, everyone has an influence on everyone else. So I've pointed this out before around the UFO thing, because there's been too much of an obsession around, there's a way to get at what they have without, the government disclosure aspect, which is loaded with deceit. And so there's a kind of, 100th monkey thing, which is if there's been some military person somewhere who's seen a dead alien and a group that's, re-engineered alien technology, then on some level we all have. And on some level, all subconscious minds are connected. If you go into the Cayce work, they asked him, he gives this incredible overview to this person who asked a question. And they said, where are you getting this information, about the person's physical condition, about their mental thing, about their regular life? Where's all this information coming from? And Cayce was very clear. He said, from the subconscious mind of the person asking the question, you already know. And, this is something, it's just hard for us to believe, which is because by nature, we're kind of trained that we need to go and find it. But it's that old thing about, it's a needle in a haystack. Well, there's also the idea that you sit on top of the haystack and the needle comes to you. It's already there. It's already there. You don't, if you, sometimes when people try to force it, I've seen that too, when they're really on this thing. I remember, and it's around the Gurdjieff work too, that I'll tell two stories about the Gurdjieff thing, and you'll remember one of them. Mm-hmm. But there was a guy that I worked with who I felt he knew a lot about the Gurdjieff work, and he was telling me about his experience with it. And I learned that he had a nervous breakdown as a result of how overly focused he was on becoming a higher version of man number 4 or something else that was in the system. And I remember thinking of how wound up he was around the whole thing and thinking to myself, it's great focus and great will to do it. But there's also, you have to be aware of the obsessive quality of something ruining the effort by overflowing. It's like a nuclear explosion. And so you have to measure those things out. And you have to be able, with things like the fourth way or any spiritual teaching, to integrate it with your regular life, or else it becomes something else and maybe something destructive. The other story, of course, is the strangeness of when mystery school people show up. Now, I've heard of other people's stories about this, and it's always very weird, but I have my own weird story about this, and there is no explanation, and Miss Olivia will remember this one.
Mm-hmm.
But I was driving driving cross country, and my car broke down in Indiana on the state line with Ohio. And this is, a while ago. And I had to go to this place in Ohio, and they said, yeah, their car will be ready tomorrow. So I had to stay overnight in this town. And what happened was I went into this bookstore, and it was pretty late.
In a strip mall.
In a strip mall.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like 8 o'clock at night, so it was like there was no one in there. And I had been after, one of the reasons on that trip, I had actually visited trying to find this particular Gurdjieff book in another state completely, in New Mexico. And very unusual, rare book, and unpublished. So I go into this bookstore, and I go up on the ladder, and this hippie comes in who has a Grateful Dead t-shirt on. And the guy was either a spiritual master or on acid. It was one of the two. I couldn't figure out which. But he comes up to me on top of the ladder, and he looks up at me, and he says, do you have, and he names the book that I'd driven across country to get. And I said, it's not published. And that, I said, but they have these three. He names the book, and he just stares at me. And then it becomes kind of strange, and he takes off. And then I take some book off the shelf and go to buy it, and the guy behind the counter says, I've never seen that guy in this place ever before. I don't know what he was doing in here, but he came in and he went straight to you. And so the mystery school adept in the Pink Floyd t-shirt and the acid routine was something.
I remember what was so vivid, what was so incredible about that. It's like if you're watching a movie and there's a soundtrack, it's like all the music stops.
Yeah.
There was such stillness. You're going, it's just, and it's this penetrating moment.
It's so weird. So weird. It was, so I happen to think that was an encounter that this group, I was in there, talk about the law of accident. I was in that town completely by accident. I was in this place, I didn't even expect to find a bookstore in that mall. And then this very unusual character comes in asking for that rare book. It was beyond strange. And he was beyond strange, It wasn't even necessarily a great comforting feeling, like, wow, this great spiritual master showed up.
No, and there was no instinct to go run after him or anything.
Right.
Because, so then you're left with that feeling afterwards, like the residue of that.
Well, you felt like he came from some other order of something, because even the book, the guy
were on their radar.
Yes.
That had to be the message.
Well, the guy behind the counter was freaked out. I remember that he was an older guy, and he was like, I have never seen that guy in here. And he said he didn't buy anything. He just took off. So, the whole atmosphere was crackling. You could feel it. But whatever it was, there was no follow-up. But I think that those encounters happen along the way, and certainly they're interesting. No question about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Gurdjieff, Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed. We're taking your questions. We're going to take a couple more, and I have one more fabulous, important quote to read you about the early hypnosis of Gurdjieff. Very interesting. Actually, I'll read one of these, and we'll take a question. Hold on. I'll just jump in here. This is a very interesting book called Gurdjieff, Very Great Enigma, a little small book by J.G. Bennett, and loaded with important information, absolutely mind-boggling. And he talks in here about this Varino quality. And this Varino quality is someone who's born a teacher, and then others recognize that teacher. And a number of things happen to these Varinos. So there's two important sections here. I'll just read a little bit of it. There was one other characteristic of Gurdjieff. Remember, Bennett knew him well. He met him in 1920. He was sent to spy on him because Gurdjieff had gotten too close to a Turkish prince, and Bennett was British intelligence, and he was spying on him, and then he got really into his teaching. He went over to the priory, and he was debating whether to join with Rudolf Steiner in anthroposophy or join with Gurdjieff at the French Institute, and he ended up going and studying with Ouspensky, and he found actually Ouspensky was a little bit depressing, even though he was highly informative. Okay. There's one other characteristic of Gurdjieff that I must refer to at once, and that is his adoption of a deliberate disguise in the form of putting himself in a bad light. This is important. He put on a mask that would tend to put people off rather than draw them towards him. Now, this method, which is called by the Sufis the way of malamat, or the methods of blame, was highly esteemed in old times among the Sufis, who regarded the sheiks who went by the way of blame as particularly eminent in spirituality. Such people represented themselves to the outside world under a bad light, partly in order to avoid attracting praise and admiration toward themselves, and also partly as a personal protection. Their way of malamat has been lost to sight in modern times. It was certainly followed under other names in Christianity also, and in all the great ways of religion. The attraction to oneself of blame rather than praise has always been approved, but it is not very much understood in our present time. There's a very particular reason for following the way of malamat, disconnected from the powers that surround people destined for high eminence in the world of spirituality. In the old Zoroastrian teaching, there was recognition of a certain power called Varino. Varino was a mark of kingship, and whoever had Varino had the power of attraction over people. He had the royal touch. The same power was recognizable by certain marks or features in the physical body. I want to say this, that Rata, when Cayce had a life as Rata, the Egyptian high priest who was bringing over the Atlantean wisdom and making the Hall of Records and everything, all of his students that he had who were adepts, that he made into adepts in that period, would reincarnate in their lives, and they could recognize each other by certain birthmarks that Rata had given them. This is extraordinary. Well, but that's what that made me think of. There's a particular reason for following the way of the malamat. Okay, so the mark of kingship. These marks showed a man destined for a very high advancement, which could either be material or spiritual. For example, the Buddha was said to bear such marks, which were recognized when he was still a child. They showed that he was destined for a very high degree of spiritual advancement. It's not possible to tell whether this meant that he would become a great king destined to rule the world or just become a great spiritual initiate. If a man bearing those marks or having the power called Varino, and this word is very interesting, it's H-V-A-R-E-N-O, Havrino, wished to follow the way of spirituality, then he had to protect himself against being drawn into messiahship or the outward exaltation of the person. One reason for following the way of malamat among people of very high spiritual destiny is to protect themselves against being put on a throne, as it were, and served or even worshipped. Gurdjieff realized this at an early age, that he possessed powers of this kind. I'm not suggesting Gurdjieff should be compared with Solomon or the Buddha, who are known to have these marks, but simply that he had a certain inborn quality of Varino, and that he became aware of this quality that could result in his coming to a position of external authority. There are pieces here, bigger pieces underneath the entire thing with Gurdjieff that I think are fascinating. And Bennett will go on to say that during this period when he was developing out of the mystery schools and doing the hypnosis, he was realizing the incredible suggestion of humanity and the being subjected to propaganda and all the rest of it, and the dangers of it, which Bennett said, if you read Brave New World, it's all there. And it's interesting because if you flash forward from Brave New World 1930 to 2024, we're right in the heart of it. But there you have the mystery wisdom, the Aldous Huxley, kind of implanting that in the culture, giving us that heads up, and the physical reality we've come into here with it. I think there's a lot in that whole piece. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Twilight Mist, isn't law of accident in part like inviting chaos to partake in your reality? And doesn't that allow, to a degree, chaos magic to interject?
I'll tell you what you made me think, and I'm not sure if this answers your question. There's a fascinating story which has to do with Edgar Cayce, about a certain figure who came into his life, and he was also psychic. He was younger, and they had this great rapport. They were just great friends. And when Cayce was traveling, Cayce traveled with a company that was looking for oil, and they were using his psychic readings to do that. And this guy came along, and this guy had such incredible energy, but it was psychic energy that was all misdirected. And he would do things. He was very into gambling. And when when Cayce was around him, he found himself doing all the things that he was doing. This guy was into gambling, and he had all these wild qualities. He'd go bet on the horses, and he would psychically try to make the horse come in, and all these very unusual things. And so Cayce found himself getting influenced, suggested by this guy's energy to do all the same kind of desperate, very intense, over-the-top, manic activities that this guy was doing. And again, this guy just had misdirected psychic energy. It wasn't that he had a bad disposition or anything like that, but he was burning himself up. And Cayce found himself living this guy's life. He was right in the heart of it. And he realized, oh my God, if I continue on with this guy, I'm going to end up just like him, and I'll be into alcohol and gambling and all this stuff. And he's missed, like, his energetic psychic track is on the wrong track. It's overflowing. It's coming out the wrong way. And it's messing. The magnetism is messing with me. It's coming over to me, and I'm acting just like him. And Cayce said when he got away from him, it was like a weird, almost like a possession that was gone. He had no desire to gamble or drink or anything like that. And the guy ended up in a nut house because he could not control that flow of the psychic energy. It came out so much, and he became just manic. So I do believe that you have to be cautious when you open that psychic channel, and it can have lots of different outcomes. At its best, it is life-saving and soul-affirming. And at its worst, it has, there's a very interesting story about Cayce himself, who had some very unusual psychic kinetic abilities as well. And there was one occasion where he was very angry as a teenager at 19 years old. And he was in his grandparents' house, and he lay down, and the entire couch went on fire. So he kind of human combusted the couch on fire. This is the weird thing about the psychic energy, which is it can go on a number of levels when it's active. It's very interesting that when Cayce would try to get out of psychic work and he would develop a photography practice, he developed this very fancy gallery for photos, and the same thing happened. It burned up. So there's something about the psychic activity which sometimes can overflow in these ways, which is why it needs to be kind of managed by some of these techniques left to us in the mystery work. Yes.
Roger Wilco, Gurdjieff believed development occurs in octaves and that there are two chances to input energy to ensure proper progression, plus how to ID those opportunities?
It's a good point. What it is Gurdjieff felt the entire laws of the universe were embedded in the Western musical system through Pythagoras. And he said that musical octaves were part of this, but also the two places on this tonal scale, E and F and B and C, which don't have any sharps or flats. And I remember my guitar teacher, when I was, I think, 12 years old, he said, remember, E.F. Hutton did not exist before Christ. And I was trying to, I had no idea what he was talking about, but he was trying to make me remember these two EFBC things. And the way that scale is laid out gives you such a pathway into understanding how spiritual development works. And in octaves, what you also find is you're on the complete other end of the creative scale. Remember, there's a very famous quote from Rudolf Steiner where he said, in the future, humanity will have a very different means of reproduction. Reproduction will happen through the action of vocal cords. And he said, this is already apparent when you see in a person in puberty, when their voice changes. We're already getting into this. And then when you think of the emphasis put on sound, you know, one of the things that Cayce put out there was that the pyramids, you know, the stones were raised with sound. The Atlanteans had it. They knew how to channel just the right tone, and everything was at their command. So there's a great deal there, and it's one of the reasons why music is so important in someone's life and into the life of humanity. I think this is the, you know, and the way that music is treated at this point is probably the lowest point in musical history. But it doesn't need to stay that way. But just on a regular level, it's all, you know, digitized, squeezed, auto-tuned. All the life is squeezed out of it. And yet, inside of music is the absolute crucial sort of bridge between the mystical world and our everyday world. So it's right there, yeah. What do you got?
Tubatorium. I've always enjoyed DJ's account of Gurdjieff encouraging his students to do physical labor. I think everybody who works in DC should get into some physical labor. And Jonquil Duray, I've always found Gurdjieff harsh on people, but I'm starting to understand him. People don't want to change or train to be aware. There's laziness.
Well, it's interesting. Gurdjieff laid all the emphasis on the physical body as the problem. He said, you know, the issue isn't that you don't have the desire to be a better person and to kind of develop your spiritual side. It's that you have a body that is loaded with lazy habits. And he started with that. And he said the main problem that he had is that students, when they came to him, they all expected roast pheasants, which I guess was the delicacy of the day, to float directly into their mouths with no effort. So the whole thing was about work and effort. And very often these high intellectuals would come to visit him at this French institute expecting a lecture. And he would be like, hey, we're digging in the back, you know, and we're digging out a new garden space. And they'd be like, what? You expect me to dig? You know? So there is this aspect of getting people into their bodies again. But there's some magic that occurs there. There's some early accounts of Ouspensky's early groups. And, you know, Ouspensky's like, it's very exciting. We're putting together this structure, and we have to all pass these stones to make this wall of stone. And so we've made it, and it was this incredible effort. We have this incredible catharsis at the end of it. And then Gurdjieff said, now you have to pass all the stones back and completely demolish the wall. And none of them wanted to do that. And he said, you know, that's the next thing. Like, the next thing is destroying what you just created. So there's no, you know, you don't get anything at the end of it. You don't get to say, oh, I made this wonderful artwork. Here it is. You put the whole thing together. And so he's emphasizing the effort, the super effort that's involved again. And if you find in the Gurdjieff work, in Ouspensky's work, in Bennett's, Orage, you know, there are phases of work, but the super effort is always involved. And the super efforts take different forms, you know, literally, like I've said before, they can involve something simple as walking home instead of driving home, but they change the level. It's doing something outside of what actually needs to be done. So you kind of get into a different mode, a different headspace. I also think that great ideas happen through efforts of that nature. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Gurdjieff Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed, and it's great to be here with the ideas room discussing Gurdjieff, who I think is very underappreciated on the mystery school side. We don't understand exactly what he brought in. Absolutely transformational. And I think that we got a little hint here tonight of just how powerful that work is. And the people around it, like Ouspensky, like Bennett, absolutely revolutionary thinkers who we can learn a great deal from. Everything from the fourth dimension to, just energies, transformation, just remarkable work sitting there in the fourth way. And once in a while, I think to myself, in some ways, the whole thing about humanity acting like a machine and needing to be aware and wake up so that they don't just become under the law of the moon and act like an automaton, seems to be one of the most important messages that came out of the mystery schools. And, a lot of the students would say things like, should I not work with technology, And technology back then wasn't even very advanced in the 30s and 40s. And he would say, no, you can become more of, a human by using a machine. You just need to use it, in an aware fashion. You need to kind of raise your awareness. And it's funny because there's a whole technique behind that. I haven't gotten too much into the technique part tonight, but certainly the self-remembering and the wheel of eyes. And then there's a very interesting factor, which is that he identified, which is called the chief feature of a person. And this is really wild because the chief feature becomes the feature around which all the other things in your personality and psychological structure and life revolve around. It's kind of like the ultimate satellite. And what's interesting is the chief feature in the case, you can't see it yourself, so you have to be in a group setting, studying Fourth Way or some other mystical tradition in order to see the chief feature. And it's interesting with Ouspensky, Gurdjieff revealed his chief feature to be extreme individualism, which I find interesting. I met a teacher of Gurdjieff's and spent some time with him. And he showed me a very interesting technique. And I was like, oh, I can believe that this technique came directly from Gurdjieff because it was so strange about blending in with nature. And this guy really had it. And he was older. He must have been in his late 80s. And he was also he always was very direct to the point. There were no niceties with him. So he had learned a very direct method, or maybe he was always like that. But he told me a few interesting stories about Gurdjieff. And I think I was 20 years old at the time when I met him. And I said, well, how do you, this thing about the chief feature? And he said, yes, the chief fault, they call it. And it is the one feature or fault that everything else revolves around. And so there's all kinds of descriptions of what it is. And I said, what's mine? I really want to know what my chief feature is. And he said, right now you couldn't handle it. So whatever my chief feature was at 20 years old, I was incapable of it. I don't think I've figured it out since, except that I am on the Enneagram wheel. I'm the boss, which I think is interesting. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Gurdjieff, Law of Accident, Secret Mystery Revealed. Wow, what a magical mystery tour this has been. We're going to take a couple more questions and then we'll light out for tonight. What do you got?
David John Moan, the goal is to become more like a child of God, not mature in the ways of the world.
Yes. Oh, yeah. The simplicity, when it comes to that deep level, I mean, you're given your mind to develop it, your emotional nature to develop it. all these things are there for you, but there needs to be a kind of a simple faith, I think, on some level, to be open to these things, because I think there's a very controlling thing, even in some of the literature around the fourth way. They think that they can think themselves into it. And I think that Gurdjieff was very anti-intellectual in that sense. So the intellect is a pathway. It's kind of directional heading. It's like the arrow pointing in the direction, but it's not the full be all and end all. It's interesting because Ouspensky himself, who spent his whole life working on Gurdjieff's system, said the key to everything that Gurdjieff taught was in the higher emotional center, but for some reason, the higher emotional center information was never fully fleshed out in Gurdjieff's work. And he wondered about that, and he said, I think the whole system is there. It's a whole complete system, but the breakthrough to the higher emotional center is not given. It's something, I guess, that we need to create. But, Ouspensky was saying, I've worked on this stuff for 40 years. How do you break through to that higher emotional system? That's interesting, because there was something missing either in Gurdjieff teaching it or in the way that the public was picking up on it. I think there's a lot
that's
of...
a really far out question to contemplate.
It is, absolutely. Gurdjieff brought a system, and he emphasized that teaching. He emphasized the movements, and he emphasized that you needed to awake and not over-identify. So the self-awareness and the self-remembering was crucial in his system. That thing that he was able to learn, we have to wonder, was he able to transmit that full teaching? That is the open question, but he's left so much. You can learn so much through that work, that maybe the effort around doing the work is the other piece, and that's the part that you bring into it. I have no doubt that that's a system that comes from a very high mystery school that Gurdjieff brought out. And we know from the accounts of Ouspensky and Bennett that he was no angel, and he wasn't a perfect person by a long shot, but he's no Aleister Crowley or something. He just, he's a master on a particular level. And it seems to me the closest he got to transmit the teaching was to Ouspensky. But I think with Ouspensky, Gurdjieff's, even though it's very interesting, because in Theosophy, you get the ascended masters, and they're off somewhere, right, on a cloud giving you this information. But in the Gurdjieff work, you're dealing with the master. You're working with the actual master. So it's a very interesting dynamic. So if you're working with that master, and, like Ouspensky maybe found out that he had spied for Russia or something like that, there was something in Ouspensky where he judged Gurdjieff and was like, I had to separate Gurdjieff from the teaching. So nonetheless, where Gurdjieff spent the time and spent the energy and brought forward this incredible teaching and incredible music that came out of the work, there's something, I think, that is an incredible impulse that he brought out of the mystery schools. And I think he was not able to do everything that he wanted with the work, but I do think it's been kind of vouchsafed for us in this century to awaken to the things that these guys brought forward. And I think between the work of Ouspensky and Bennett, they brought the Gurdjieff work up to be more palatable to a Western audience. And it's there, it's graspable, and the challenge is great. Yes.
The Brawlbox says, DJ is right. Ouspensky was the one who got near to an understanding. Listening to you tonight, I think Gurdjieff he reached a plateau. I think there was a big piece missing there. And I think it probably has something to do with the fact that he was still so egotistical.
Yeah.
And that there was a block there where whatever work he had to do on himself, he was unwilling to do. His pride wouldn't let him get down as far on his knees for as long as possible for that transformation to truly take place.
Wow. It's an excellent point. And yet he spent this time teaching that dance troupe the moves and spreading this. It's an incredible achievement that he was able to bring forward. And then you think by the end of his life, did he achieve what he set out? Well, there's one of his biggest students of all time, Frank Lloyd Wright. Isn't that a truth?
Another egomaniac.
With J.G. Bennett. You know, there's something, every once in a while, I'll be in a situation and I'll see, you know, those types of people who need something to go wrong to have an emotional explosion. And you'll see them in everyday life, whether they're on the road or whatever it happens to be. And you can see, you know, when Gurdjieff would talk about you're a broken machine, you know, you can be fixed through these techniques. And how many broken machines do we encounter on the highway of life? A lot. They're people, but you can see from the point of view of the system, they start acting mechanically. And it's interesting, when I was talking about the accumulators earlier, Gurdjieff would say, you know, somebody having the ability to control their emotions is very important, because if they absolutely let go, you know, with an emotional response, it's like an explosion in the factory, and it takes a long time to repair the factory. So, you know, that's interesting. I mean, we hear about other teachers who needed that hot temper, like Blavatsky. This is very interesting. It's a little advertisement that Ouspensky saw before he met Gurdjieff or anything. It's called The Struggle of the Magicians. And it was an advertisement for a play that never even happened. It's a very unusual little piece of art, and it ran in Ouspensky's newspaper. This is what got him involved. And I think it's quite unique. And it was very interesting because it was like, oh, this, you know, the write-up was odd too. It struck him as strange. It was like, oh, this master from the East is putting together a ballet, The Struggle of the Magicians. And it was almost like some kind of a mystery school message, you know. There was no ballet. There was nothing. But there was a message out there about the Struggle of the Magicians piece. This is Gurdjieff as a hypnotist before he came out and did any of the teaching or whatever. Here he is on the learning curve. And it's interesting because Ouspensky, when he went to visit with Gurdjieff's father and, you know, went with Gurdjieff to his house, he saw this picture on the wall and he figured out immediately. He said, oh, he was a stage hypnotist. And then later they found out that that was true. So Gurdjieff learned very subtle things about the unconscious of the human mind, and he was able to bring that into studying the mysteries. Last question, Miss Olivia.
This is my question. Do you think that it seems that there's a running theme with the students of Gurdjieff?
Yes.
That he attracted particularly egotistical students that needed to be cut down.
Oh,
and that
yeah.
he took great joy in cutting them down,
Yes.
as opposed to the idiots and all that. So, do you think that was his purpose as a teacher? Was that to
Yes. Yeah.
attack the ego?
In some ways, he's a fantastic teacher. What's interesting is there were some people who were set to please him. And there's this one guy who's a filmmaker, and he just wanted to be, you know, Gurdjieff's top boy. And Gurdjieff asked him to get this very hard to get bottle of liquor. And the guy ran all over town looking for this thing. And Gurdjieff said, you can't be back here after 8 o'clock. I'm only going to be here at 8 o'clock. I'll meet you at 8 o'clock. But if it's 1 minute past 8, I'm out. And the guy finds it. He makes the tab. He finds the rare, you know, Armagnac, whatever it is. And he runs up to Gurdjieff. And Gurdjieff looks at the bottle and looks at him and says, never rush. So this is this is an interesting lesson. There are lessons in Gurdjieff. I think what's so interesting about Gurdjieff is the teaching very often are in people's accounts, and it is the last portion of his life, say the last 20 years, were all about the art of living. And very often, we look for certain speeches or teachings or books that a person had at a different period. But sometimes, like Krishnamurti, it's the whole piece is really about the art of living. And, that's why there's so many accounts of Gurdjieff changing these people's lives by the things that he said or the things that he did, and not necessarily Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. However, I will say this about Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, which is a fascinating book, which Ouspensky said, no, it's the ravings of a madman. I'm not, I don't see the point in it. And yet, there are things in that book that are extraordinary. I will tell you, this is what's in the book. UFOs are in the book. As a matter of fact, Beelzebub is in a spaceship in the entire book. Time travel is in the book. They go to Atlantis on multiple occasions. And there are incredible accounts in the book about how to achieve, higher energies, higher mental states, and pure human transformation and what the issue is. And there's a whole thing about Mars in there too. The book is extraordinary, and it takes forever to get through. It is the Ulysses of esoteric information. And yet, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson is a classic nonetheless. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think we are done with our presentation.
Everybody's focusing on the picture you showed with the hidden hand.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Isn't that fascinating? Well, I'll tell you, there are a few different people, including Cayce. I can think of a number of others who discovered their talents through hypnosis. And there's something so important in hypnosis. There's been a paper that's been waiting to come out for 100 years, which I've just gotten my hands on in relation to it. And it has a great deal to do with early Mesmer, who is included, Mesmer's in Beelzebub's Tale, but both Blavatsky and Gurdjieff speak very highly about what Mesmer was up to. And Mesmer is the originator of actual hypnosis. But remember, hypnosis, what was going on there, was all about magnetism. And the magnetism, the animal magnetism, was all about the healing aspect. And what he would do, Mesmer, is he would create a pool of water, put a stick in it, and once the water was magnetized, the stick would hold the magnetism, the person would hold the stick and get well. So, that's going to put the medical authorities out of business. And so they ran him out of France. But the mystery school, Cagliostro sent out by a mystery school, Mesmer sent out by a mystery school, Gurdjieff, I have no question. But Ouspensky was convinced that Gurdjieff somewhere between 1920 and 1930 lost contact with the mystery schools. And I think it's possible. I do think it's possible. But nonetheless, an incredible legacy with him. And with
lost
that...
contact?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well...
Did they cut him off? Were they disapproving of his behavior?
I think that the phase, they had let him out there to do his thing, basically. And I think at a certain phase, they cut him loose and were like,
Well, does that sound like wash their hands of him?
It could be, but it also could be, it needs to be something that he does on his own. Let's see what he does on his own. Remember what Bennett says about Gurdjieff and what the mystery schools may have been doing with Gurdjieff is he was experimenting all the way up until the last few days of his life. So he was always working on a new technique, a new method. He was trying to bring it about. And so he understood the level of change that humanity changed and that you had to constantly be at this method of transformation. So the mystery schools with him, certainly they decided this guy can do a lot of things on his own. Let him go out and experiment with humanity with these techniques. But Ouspensky felt, when I met him, he was in with the mystery schools. I felt it and the impact that it had on me. and it transformed everyone. But later, that same person, I didn't feel like he had the same contacts going on. So it could very well be that he lost contact with those schools. And but nonetheless, we got the whole piece about the Sarmoung Brotherhood was nowhere on the record. But I'll tell you what's weird about Meetings with Remarkable Men. One, it's like the hit single in the Gurdjieff work because they made a movie out of it. It's an easy book to read. It shows that Gurdjieff knew how to write a bestseller if he wanted to. And it's all about his life and searching for the Sarmoung Brotherhood. And it is a fascinating book. But there's two very telling pieces of information in it. One, he goes along the way and he encounters people from the Essene Brotherhood. Well, the Essene Brotherhood ended after the crucifixion of Christ. They had been set up, the Essenes, the term means expectancy. They had expected Christ and they had trained him. And they trained Christ in numerology, astrology, all these different pieces. And so the Essene Brotherhood was long gone. So for him to encounter the Essene Brotherhood doesn't make any sense unless, we're talking about no time, no space at a certain point. That's one weird thing, and that's in Meetings with Remarkable Men. The other thing is Prince Lubavitch. And Lubavitch is an interesting term because I'm not Russian. That might not be the right pronunciation. But Lubavitch, what people found out when they were examining it, the word means love of knowledge. So it's Prince Love of Knowledge. And he's a very important character in Gurdjieff's development. It's this rich, wealthy Russian prince who is also on the search for the Sarmoung Brotherhood. So his name means love of knowledge. I always found that very compelling little piece hanging out in the middle of the Gurdjieff work. And the other thing, of course, is that the person who helps him find the map to get to the Sarmoung Brotherhood, what's his name? X. Mm-hmm. The X steganography sitting right in the middle of the Gurdjieff work, can't be denied. So absolutely promising, potent work in the Gurdjieff work. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're done. Gurdjieff, Law of Accidents, Secret Mystery Revealed.
There was a little confusion and an accusation that you dodged the hidden hand question.
No, not at all. I mean, it's a picture of him as a stage magician. And then some people, think, hey, that's the Masonic hand gesture. Could be. I mean, I think Gurdjieff's kind of a gadfly as he jumped into Buddhist tradition, Tibetan tradition, the Sufis. I think he went around saying, oh, you know what? A certain amount is over here in India. That's practice. A certain amount is over here in Persia. That's theory. A certain amount is in Egypt. That's philosophy. I'm going to put them all together and make them into one solid system. So did he spend time among the Masons? He very well could be. But remember, not all the Mason groups are pernicious either. That's a myth. And a lot of them hold that incredibly potent tradition. And it's interesting because that's a lead into an episode we have coming up in November.
He's a sneaky man.
He's the Sly Man. The way of the Sly Man is what he said. The fourth way was the way of the Sly Man. So, it's interesting because there was this religious scholar who sat down with him and said, where did you get the system from? And Gurdjieff said, it's the ABC. And he said, yes, but how did you get it? Like, did the Holy Fathers at Mount Athos give it to you? And he said, maybe I stole it. Maybe he did. But there's no question. It is the system for the harmonious development of humanity. It's in there. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're to our super chatters.
So I need to thank Elarmanine Bay, Don Neway, Thermobsterful, Harvardian, Slow Time, Jay Parsons, Eurythmia's Fun, Descat Brock, Global Atlantis, Terry Doherty, Medley Childress, St. John Penwell Chidester III, Erica Swenson Elliott, Xander, Corey Cartier, and Empire of Light. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow. Makes all the difference. Thank you for your support. And to all our subscribers, we can't thank you enough. We couldn't do it without you. I have a final quote on the law of accident for you, and then I'll do some shout outs. Gurdjieff now. Man lives in life under the law of accident and under two kinds of influences, again governed by accident. The first kind are influences created in life itself, by life itself, influences of race, nation, country, climate, family, education, society, profession, manners and customs, wealth, poverty, current ideas, and so on. The second kind are influences created outside this life, influences of the inner circle, or esoteric influences, that is, created under different laws, although also on the earth. These influences differ from the former, first of all, in being conscious in their origin. This means that they have been created consciously by conscious men for definite purposes. Influences of this kind are usually embodied in the form of religious systems and teachings, philosophical doctrines, works of art, and so on. They are let out into life for a definite purpose and become mixed with influences of the first kind. But it must be borne in mind that these influences are conscious only in their origin. Coming into the general vortex of life, they fall under the general law of accident and begin to act mechanically. That is, they may act on certain definite men or may not act. They may reach him or they may not. They are under the law of accident. We need to really, this is touching on the law of accident is a crucial factor. And I think it's going to get us to a very deep place in understanding this. Gurdjieff is laying it out there. It's an open invitation, but you can see there's something in what he's saying about accident that is a crucial universal concept that we need to bring into this conversation. And with that, we will wrap it up. But before we go, we will do a couple of shout outs here to everyone. All right. Whew. Jimmy Kemener, Michael Woods, Dan Light, Don Newway, Jessica Rodriguez. It's great to see you out there. Love the show tonight. I have learned so much about Gurdjieff. Wow, there's a lot there. And let me tell you, the work is powerful. I can say that after having spent a number of decades on it. Unbelievable. Fern Fakes, Roger Z, Corey Anderson. Amazing show. Thank you so much. Thank you, Corey. It's great to have you here. Whew. There are some Gurdjieff-ites in the audience tonight. You could tell it. Thanks, DJ and Miss Olivia. Excellent work as always. Let's see what else we got here. Casey said the Essenes became the first Christians and the churches. Yeah, they were the mystery school that came from the Elijah and the Prophets mystery school. And they had the knowledge, the super knowledge of everything from numerology to palmistry to astrology. There's a Casey reading about Judy, who guided Jesus throughout his life, and she was a master of astral projection. Very interesting indeed. The fourth way, the way of the fox. Yes, the way of the sly man. No, I don't want it to end tonight. That's Jessica Rodriguez again. What a great comment. Roger Z, Fern Fakes. Great people out there tonight. Dead Moon Uncles. I'll have to figure out what that means. I have 3 Dead Mason uncles. Oh, well, I bet they knew a great deal. No question about it. DJ did 2 shows in one day. Yeah, how about me? Wayne Peak, we were all warriors. Isn't that the truth? Especially now. Esther Taylor, Najat Madre, thanks for a great show. It's great to have you out there. Let's see. CC, Nanette Christ, fantastic to see you. Wow, what an incredible, incredible artist. I've never seen anything like the portrait that she's done of the Ascended Masters, and in particular Rata, which we've used on a number of occasions. But thank you. DJ and Olivia, thank you for your great depth and meaning tonight. And Scarlet Flyer, I had fun. I like that. I'll leave it at that. We will see you all next week. Of course, we'll be diving in with a huge election special. And I will be posting the Sam Tripoli interview on my Twitter, and I'll include it in the next newsletter as well. That was a good time. And thank you, Sam. And we had great people out there tonight. Gigi was out there tonight. Wow, it's great to see her back and doing shows after the incredible disaster she went through in North Carolina. Amazing. And we're wishing her the absolute best. And we're going to have her back on the show. So we're talking about that, and we'll have her back on in the next couple of weeks, but just extraordinary. And what else? We talked about the Walter Bosley NIMSA conference last week. And now I think that I saw that Walter said that those are going to come out, the one that I did and the one that Farrell did and some other people who were there. So we'll see. That should be a blast. And let's see who else we got out there. Happy Hermit. Wow, great crowd. Thomas Ball, great to see you, sir. Don Nue. Hooray for Gigi. Indeed. We will see you all next week. And, it's going to be a wild ride right up to the election. So we'll do our best to keep it mystical while everything else is going on.
Can I share something really beautiful?
Yes.
Okay, so Juliet of the Spirit said this. Now I lay me down to rest. Angels guard my little nest. Like the wee bird in the tree, the heavenly spirit cares for me. She says that prayer was given to me by a dying woman who thought her life was worthless and without power. She shared the prayer with me, and I promised to give it to thousands of people. So there you have it.
Isn't that wonderful?
It's a beautiful little prayer.
Wow.
I'm going to copy it down because, it turns us into little children.
That could be your quote of the night, I think.
I have much more cynical, but I did want to share that. Maybe I'll do them both.
Incredible. The things that people come through with, amazing. We'll see you all next week. And, it says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
Never really ends. And remember, never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and that could be coming around the mountain again. We'll see you all next week. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
God bless.
What a blast. Scary monsters. So sad. Happy Halloween.